What the Grieving Leave Behind, a story by Ripper's Nighttime Tales. There is a room in Boston where grieving people go to feel less alone. This is the story of the man who built it, and the woman who sat 3 feet away from him and refused to look away. Least discretion is advised. We begin in a basement in Charlestown.
What the Grieving Leave Behind by Ripper's Nighttime Tales. Act 1, Session 1, Cold Open. The rain always made it easier. Marcus Hales stood at the utility sink in the basement on Medford Street, scrubbing his forearms with the calm, practiced motion of a man washing off garden soil. The water ran pink, then pale, then clear. He watched it spiral down the drain the way he watched most things, with detached, clinical patience. Behind him, the room was quiet now. It hadn't been quiet 20 minutes ago. The space was small, maybe 14 by 16 feet, the kind of basement unit Boston landlords rented to graduate students who needed cheap storage and asked no questions. Marcus had signed the lease under the name Daniel Marsh 18 months ago, paid 6 months at a time in money orders, and had never once encountered his upstairs neighbor face to face. The walls were original brick, thick and indifferent. He'd tested that early on. Sound didn't travel, not even the kind of sound that had filled this room tonight. He dried his hands on a clean white towel, always white, always fresh, and turned back to the work of tidying. The man on the floor had been named Trevor Paulson, 41 years old, divorced, estranged from a daughter in Providence who wouldn't think to call him for another 2 weeks at least. Marcus knew this because Trevor's sister, Carol, had spent 40 minutes talking about Trevor during last month's Mending Boston session, how he'd isolated himself after the divorce, how he'd stopped returning calls, how she worried but felt helpless. Carol had cried. Marcus had handed her a tissue and nodded with warm, sorrowful eyes. He'd written Trevor Paulson, isolated, no immediate contact, Sister Carol, guilt, not active concern, in his journal that same evening, in the same careful handwriting he used to log session notes. Trevor had lasted longer than Marcus expected. That was the honest professional assessment. Most people, when the moment arrived, collapsed inward shock, shutting down the body faster than the injury itself. Trevor had been a fighter, which Marcus respected in the abstract way a chess player respected a difficult opponent. It had required adjustment, improvisation, the kind of controlled escalation that Marcus didn't prefer but had learned to manage without losing himself to it. He preferred clean. He preferred efficient. Tonight had been neither, which was why the room now looked the way it did. He didn't look at Trevor again. Looking served no purpose at this stage. Trevor Paulson had been a problem to solve. Carol's grief manufactured and deepened in one efficient motion. Marcus's needs met. The city's missing persons statistics incremented by one more middle-aged man nobody was actively searching for. The equation was complete. Sentiment had no variable in it. Marcus pulled on a fresh pair of latex gloves and began. He worked methodically, the way he did everything. Plastic sheeting first, folded with the precision of someone who had done it many times in many rooms. Then the bag contractor grade. The kind sold in bulk at hardware stores across the city where nobody remembered faces. He'd bought these particular bags in Quincy, 8 months ago, with cash. He bought everything with cash, in neighborhoods he didn't otherwise frequent, spaced far enough apart in time that patterns couldn't form. Patterns were how men like him got caught. He thought about that sometimes men like him, and found the phrase both accurate and insufficient. There were no men quite like him. He'd read the case files, the psychological profiles, the true crime narratives that his support group clients sometimes brought up in session with a kind of horrified fascination. He understood the taxonomy. He simply didn't fit cleanly inside it. He wasn't driven by rage. He felt no particular hatred toward Trevor Paulson, or anyone who had come before Trevor Paulson. He experienced no sexual component, no escalating frenzy, none of the dysfunction the profiles described. What he felt, the closest word he'd found, after considerable reflection, was appetite. A quiet, persistent hunger that had nothing to do with the victims themselves and everything to do with the order he imposed on chaos. The selection, the patience, the execution. Grief counseling had been the natural expression of the same instinct, really. Both required the ability to sit with suffering and feel nothing but the cool satisfaction of control. He sealed the bag. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the single high basement window. Marcus paused, listening. He found rain genuinely pleasant. Always had. There was something honest about it. The city stripped of its daytime performance. The streets emptied. The whole elaborate fiction of Boston's civility washed momentarily gray. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. He had a 9 o'clock session tomorrow morning. A new client. A young woman named Priya, who had lost her mother to a sudden cardiac event and was struggling with what she described in her intake form as unmanageable guilt. Priya would need careful handling. The guilty ones always arrived raw and open in ways that required a particular quality of attention. Marcus enjoyed the guilty ones. He gathered the last of the materials, broke down the folding table he kept stored behind the water heater, and conducted his final walkthrough of the room. Bare concrete, bare brick, the faint smell of industrial cleaner he would allow to air out over the next 2 days before he returned for the secondary clean. Nothing that shouldn't be here. Nothing that said anything about anything. He turned off the single overhead bulb. In the dark, standing at the door, Marcus Hale allowed himself one moment of stillness. Not guilt, not relief, just the clean, settling quiet of a thing completed. Then he buttoned his coat, the brown one, wool, practical, picked up the contractor bag with both hands, and stepped out into the Boston rain. 8 hours later, he would hand Priya a box of tissues and tell her, in his softest voice, that grief doesn't end, it just finds a new shape. Act 1, Session 2, The Shepherd at Work. The Mending Boston support group met every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in a second-floor office suite on Newbury Street, sandwiched between a yoga studio and a small accounting firm that kept irregular hours. The building was old Boston brick, the kind that absorbed winter cold and held it through April, and the hallway outside Suite 204 always smelled faintly of bergamot from the candle the yoga instructor burned 2 doors down. Danny Reyes arrived 12 minutes early because she always arrived early to things that made her nervous, and this made her nervous. She stood outside the frosted glass door with the small printed placard that read Mending Boston, Dr. Hale, LCMHC, and took a slow breath. Her supervisor at Boston Family Services had described the placement as straightforward. A well-regarded private grief support group, excellent community reputation. The facilitator open to bringing on a co-facilitator to help manage an expanding client load. 6 weeks of observation, then a formal evaluation. Simple. Danny had learned not to trust the word simple. She pushed open the door. The office was warm in a way that felt deliberate, soft amber lighting from 2 floor lamps rather than the overhead fluorescence, which had been left off. A circle of 8 chairs, cushioned, arranged with careful symmetry on a round wool rug in muted greens and browns. A small table near the window held a coffee carafe, a box of herbal tea, and a plate of shortbread cookies that nobody ever seemed to eat, but that were always there. Danny would learn that later. She noticed them now only because they were the kind of detail that made a room feel managed rather than lived in. A man was adjusting one of the chairs by a 1/4 inch when she walked in. He looked up and smiled, and the smile reached his eyes completely, which was the first thing she registered. The second thing was the cardigan. Brown, cable knit, the kind of garment that suggested libraries and patience and a total absence of ego. He was perhaps 50, slim, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the unhurried posture of someone who had never once been late to anything. "You must be Danny," he said. His voice was exactly what you would design if you were engineering a voice for this specific room. Low, unhurried, warm without being performative. "I'm Marcus. I'm glad you found us, not me." Danny filed that away without knowing why. "Dr. Hale," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for the opportunity. I've read a lot about your work with complicated grief populations." "Marcus, please." He shook her hand with both of his, brief and genuine. "Dr. Hale belongs on the placard. In here we use first names. It matters more than people think, the small equalities." He gestured toward the chair to his immediate left. "I usually sit here. Tonight just watch, get a feel for the group dynamic. Jump in if something moves you, but no pressure. These folks have been together long enough to feel the difference between a real response and a professional one, so I always tell new co-facilitators, trust your instincts over your training when the two disagree." Danny nodded. It was good advice. That almost bothered her slightly, that it was genuinely good advice delivered by someone she'd known for 40 seconds. The group began arriving at 6:53. Danny watched Marcus greet each person by name, each greeting slightly different and specifically calibrated. A hand on the shoulder for a heavy-set man in his 60s named Frank, who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees hurt but who refused to say so. A warm two-handed handshake for a young woman named Priya, dark-eyed and hollowed out in the particular way of recent loss, who managed a small smile in return. A simple nod and eye contact for a man named Gerald, who sat immediately and looked at his hands, and who Danny understood without being told was in the phase of grief where presence was already an act of enormous effort. 7 people total, including a middle-aged woman named Carol, who arrived last, slightly breathless, and who Marcus greeted with a particular softness that suggested she was carrying something heavier than the others this week. Carol settled into her chair and pressed her lips together and stared at the cold coffee carafe and said nothing. Marcus let the silence sit for a full 30 seconds before he spoke. Danny counted. Most facilitators couldn't hold silence for more than 10 seconds before anxiety pushed them to fill it. 30 seconds was a long time in a room with 7 grieving people. It felt like a full minute. It felt like he owned it completely. "Let's start where we always start," Marcus said quietly. "Who's carrying something in tonight that they didn't have last week?" Carol's chin trembled. She didn't speak yet, but her hand moved to her jacket pocket and closed around something there, some small object she needed to touch. Danny watched Marcus watch Carol. His expression was open and patient and full of something that looked precisely like compassion. Danny would think about his eyes in that moment many times over the following weeks. She would try to identify what had made her vaguely uneasy without being able to name it. It wasn't coldness exactly, it was more like the compassion was perfect, technically, structurally perfect, like a painting of a fire that had no heat. She told herself she was projecting. She told herself that grief workers developed a necessary professional distance and that she was reading clinical skill as detachment because she was nervous and new and prone to overthinking in quiet rooms. She was right about one thing, she was definitely overthinking, but she was wrong about what she was seeing. Carol finally spoke. Her brother Trevor had missed their weekly check-in call for the 3rd time in a row. She'd filed a casual inquiry with the police, not a missing persons report, just an inquiry, and they'd been kind but not concerned. Adults went quiet sometimes, they'd said, especially ones going through difficult periods. She should give it another week. "He's never gone 3 weeks without calling," Carol said. "Not since our mother died. We made a promise." "That promise still matters," Marcus said. "Even if he can't keep it right now, the fact that you're holding it for both of you, that's love, Carol. That's what love looks like when it's tested." Carol nodded, tears sliding quietly down her face. Frank reached over and briefly covered her hand with his large one without a word. Priya looked at her lap. Gerald stared at the rug. Danny felt her throat tighten the way it always did when grief in a room became real and collective rather than clinical and individual. She reached for her notepad and then stopped herself, remembering what Marcus had said. Trust instinct over training. She put the notepad away. Across the circle, Marcus was listening to Carol with his full and total attention, his head slightly inclined, his hands loose in his lap. Somewhere behind those warm and patient eyes, in a part of himself he had long since sealed off from anything resembling conscience, he was noting that Carol's inquiry with the police had been casual rather than formal. He was noting that he had approximately 2 more weeks of clean margin. He was noting that Carol's grief, when it fully arrived, would be the complicated kind. The kind tangled up in guilt and unanswered calls and promises made to dead mothers. The kind that kept people coming back to a room like this one for years. He let Carol finish. He thanked her for sharing. He moved the group gently to Gerald, who had something small to offer tonight, a single memory of his wife that had surfaced that week while he was washing dishes, and the group received it with the quiet reverence that only people who understood loss could offer. Marcus guided the session the way a conductor guides an orchestra. No single instrument too loud, no silence allowed to curdle into despair. The overall shape of the evening moving from pain towards something that felt, by 8:45, almost like bearable. Danny walked out onto Newberry Street afterward, in the cool April air, and stood for a moment listening to the distant sound of traffic on Boylston. She felt the way she always felt after a good session, wrung out and oddly grateful and more certain than ever that this work mattered. Marcus appeared beside her, pulling on his coat, the brown wool one. "First impressions?" he asked. "They trust you completely," she said. "That takes a long time to build." "It takes consistency," he said, "showing up the same way every time." People in grief are exquisitely sensitive to performance. They've already lost something real. They can smell a substitute from across a room. He buttoned the top button of his coat and glanced up at the sky, which had gone the color of old pewter, clouds heavy and low. Rain tonight, I think. Does it bother you? Danny asked. The weight of it, carrying other people's loss week after week. Marcus considered the question with the appearance of genuine reflection. No, he said finally. I find it clarifying, actually. Other people's grief reminds you of what's real. What matters. He smiled, brief and warm. Get home safe, Danny. I'll see you next Tuesday. He walked south on Newbury, hands in his pockets, unhurried, disappearing into the thickening dusk. Danny watched him go for a moment longer than she needed to. She told herself it was nothing. She went home. Act 1. Session 3. The Shape of a Target. Danny Reyes had chosen grief counseling for the same reason most people chose it. She understood loss from the inside. She had been 19 when her father walked out of a corner store on Blue Hill Avenue and into the path of a car running a red light. Gone in the space between one ordinary errand and the next. No warning, no illness, no chance to prepare. Just a Tuesday afternoon that ended one way and should have ended another. She had spent the following 2 years learning that grief did not move in stages the way the pamphlets described. It moved in ambushes. It hid in grocery store aisles, and in the smell of certain coats, and in the particular quality of late afternoon light in October. It found you when you were almost fine, and reminded you with total precision that almost was not the same thing as healed. She had gone back to school because sitting still felt like drowning. She had chosen social work because helping other people name their pain had turned out to be the only reliable way to keep her own from swallowing her whole. Her supervisor at Boston Family Services had once described her as one of the most naturally attuned practitioners she had encountered in 20 years. Danny had thanked her and immediately worried she was doing something wrong. That was the other thing about Danny Reyes. She trusted her instincts about other people with considerable accuracy, and trusted her instincts about herself almost not at all. She spent the week between her first and second Mending Boston sessions reviewing her notes from the initial meeting, which were sparse because she had put the notepad away and were therefore mostly impressions rather than observations. Frank, the older man, protective instinct toward the group, possibly former law enforcement or military based on posture and the way he scanned the room when he entered. Priya, recent loss, the kind of fresh wound grief that made a person transparent. Gerald, further along but stuck, the way people got stuck when they had nobody to move forward for. Carol, the most fragile in the room that night, carrying a grief that had not yet been given its full name because her brother was only missing and not yet confirmed gone. She paused on Carol's name for a long moment. Something nagged at her about the evening that she couldn't quite resolve. Not Marcus exactly, more like the room around Marcus. The way the grief in that circle had a particular texture she couldn't fully account for. Most support groups she had observed felt like collections of individual wounds that slowly learned to coexist. Mending Boston felt more like a pattern, a thing that had been arranged. She could not have explained what she meant by that if someone had asked, and so she did not write it down. She told herself she was new and pattern seeking was what new clinicians did when they were anxious. She closed the notebook and went to bed. On Thursday of that week, Marcus called her on her work line, which she noted because she had given him her work number on the intake paperwork, and most supervisors used email. His voice on the phone was identical to his voice in person, unhurried, warm. He wanted to give her some background on the group members before next Tuesday, so she wasn't walking in cold a second time. Would she have 20 minutes for a call? She said yes. He was thoughtful and precise in his descriptions. Frank Caruso, 64, retired, had lost his wife to pancreatic cancer 11 months prior. A private man who showed up every week without fail and rarely initiated but always responded when addressed. Good anchor energy for the group. Priya Anand, 31, lost her mother 6 weeks ago to sudden cardiac arrest, still in acute grief, possibly complicated by pre-existing anxiety. Gerald Marsh, 56, widower, 2 years out, stuck in what Marcus described as anticipatory grief for a future that would never happen now. And Carol Weaver, 52, whose brother Trevor had gone quiet, and whose distress was currently at a level Marcus was monitoring closely. I may move her to individual sessions if the group container starts feeling insufficient, Marcus said. She's close to a threshold, I can usually tell. How long have you been doing this? Danny asked. 15 years in private practice. Before that, hospital-based grief work at Mass General. Before that, he paused, just briefly. Personal experience, like most people who end up in this field. Your sister, Danny said, remembering what she had read in his practice biography on the Mending Boston website. Yes. The word was quiet and complete and invited no follow-up. Danny did not follow up. She thanked him for the call and sat for a moment after hanging up with the vague feeling of having been given exactly the right amount of information to feel informed while somehow learning very little. She cataloged his descriptions of the group members and found them technically accurate based on her one observation and entirely devoid of anything that revealed how Marcus himself felt about any of them. Most grief workers leaked affect when they talked about their clients, not because they were unprofessional, but because the work lived in them and surfaced in small ways. A softening in the voice, a pause before a name, some small sign that the person being described had weight in the speaker's interior world. Marcus's descriptions had been precise and complete and utterly weightless. She filed it under professional distance and moved on with her week. Marcus, for his part, spent Thursday evening in his apartment on Commonwealth Avenue reviewing his journal. The journal was a standard black hardcover notebook, the kind sold in any bookstore, indistinguishable from the session notes and professional development logs stacked beside it on his desk. He kept it in plain sight for that reason. Hidden things attracted attention. Things hidden in plain sight attracted nothing at all. He had learned this before he learned almost anything else. He opened to the current working page and read the entry he had made after last Tuesday's session. Beneath Trevor Paulson's now closed entry, 3 names had been added in the past 2 weeks, drawn not from Mending Boston directly, but from the peripheral intelligence the group generated. Carol had mentioned a coworker named Dennis who had reached out after hearing about Trevor, someone she described as kind but whom she barely knew. A loose connection. Frank had mentioned a nephew in Somerville who had recently gone through a divorce and stopped returning family calls, a detail offered as a point of commonality with Carol's situation. Gerald had mentioned, almost in passing, a downstairs neighbor who had lost her husband the previous year and who Gerald occasionally checked on. A woman named Ruth who had no local family and who Gerald described as deeply isolated. Marcus had written all 3 names down. He did not select from his own group. That was a rule he had made early and kept absolutely. The group was infrastructure. The group was intelligence and cover and the long patient work of manufacturing grief that kept his practice full and his calendar legitimate. Hunting inside it would be like burning down the building you lived in. But the periphery, the peripheral people, the ones mentioned in passing, the barely connected ones that group members referenced and then forgot they had referenced, those were a different matter entirely. He read the 3 names again. Dennis, co-worker of Carol's, loose connection, no further details yet. Frank's nephew in Somerville, divorced, withdrawn, possibly more isolated than family realized. Ruth, Gerald's neighbor, no local family, recently widowed. Ruth. He wrote a small circle beside her name. Not a decision, an inclination, the beginning of attention. He closed the journal and set it beside his session notes and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and sat by the window watching the lights of Commonwealth Avenue reflected in the wet pavement below. It had rained again. It had rained 4 of the last 7 days, which Marcus found privately satisfying in a way he had never bothered to examine. He thought about Danny Reyes. She was perceptive. That had been clear from the first session. Not in a threatening way, not yet, but in the way of someone whose instincts were good and whose self-doubt had so far kept those instincts from fully trusting themselves. That self-doubt was useful. It was a buffer between what she noticed and what she acted on. Most people had it. Most people never got past it, but some people did. He would need to watch her, carefully and without appearing to watch her at all, which was a thing he was extremely good at. He finished his scotch, he rinsed the glass, he went to bed at 10:30, as he always did, and slept without difficulty, as he always did, and in the morning he woke and made coffee, and reviewed his schedule and moved through his Tuesday with the clean, quiet efficiency of a man who had nothing on his conscience, because he had, long ago and very deliberately, stopped keeping one. The following Tuesday, Danny arrived at Suite 204 again 12 minutes early. Marcus was already there, adjusting a chair. He looked up and smiled, and the smile reached his eyes completely. "Danny," he said, "I'm glad you're back." Outside on Newbury Street, the first drops of rain began to fall. Act 2, Session 1. Ruth Callahan had lived in the same third-floor apartment on Perkins Street in Jamaica Plain for 22 years. She had moved in with her husband David the summer after their wedding, back when Jamaica Plain was still a neighborhood people moved to because it was affordable rather than because it was fashionable. And she had stayed because leaving felt like agreeing that the life she had built there was over. David had been gone 14 months. The apartment still smelled like him in places. The hall closet where his coats still hung because Ruth had not yet found a version of herself that could take them down. The bathroom cabinet where his shaving things remained on the left side shelf because moving them to make space felt obscene. She had read somewhere that this was normal. She had read a great deal about grief in the 14 months since David died. The way people did when they were hoping to find a map and kept finding only other people's descriptions of being lost. Gerald from downstairs checked on her on Sundays. He would knock twice, quietly, and she would make tea, and they would sit at her kitchen table and talk about ordinary things. The garden in the building's small backyard, the new coffee place on Center Street, whether the Sox had any reasonable hope this season. They never talked directly about loss, but it was present in everything they said. A third person at the table, patient and permanent. Ruth was grateful for Gerald in the uncomplicated way you were grateful for things that asked nothing from you. She had no other regular contact. Her sister lived in Portland and called on birthdays and holidays with genuine warmth and genuine distance in equal measure. Her friends from the years before David's illness had thinned in the way friends thinned when grief went on longer than people expected grief to go on. Not unkindly, just gradually the way water found its own level. She worked part-time at a plant nursery in Roslindale 3 days a week, which got her out of the apartment and kept her hands in soil, which she found grounding in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The owner, a quiet Vietnamese woman named Mai, asked no questions and expected only that Ruth show up on time and handle the plants with care, both of which Ruth managed reliably. She was, in the clinical language Marcus would have used if he had ever met her formally, a deeply isolated individual with a narrow support network, no immediate family in the area, and a grief trajectory that had plateaued into a low-grade permanent ache that she had begun to mistake for simply being her personality now. Marcus had never met Ruth Callahan formally. He had found her the same way he found most of the peripheral ones, carefully, quietly. Through the slow accumulation of small details, Gerald's offhand mention of her in session 3 weeks prior, a follow-up mention 2 sessions later, something about Ruth having a difficult week because the anniversary of David's death was approaching. A name, a building, a floor, a rough shape of a life. From there, the rest was patience. He had walked down Perkins Street on a Wednesday afternoon, unhurried, the brown coat, hands in pocket, taking in the building with the practiced disinterest of someone who lived in the neighborhood and had no particular reason to look at anything. Third floor, corner unit, window boxes with late-season plants going brown and leggy, a light on in the evenings by 7. No visitors that he had observed on 3 separate passes at different times of day and week. He had confirmed the name on the buzzer panel, R. Callahan 3C. He had written a small circle beside her name in his journal, and then, over the following week, upgraded it to a full mark. The selection process was the part Marcus found most genuinely absorbing. Not the research exactly, though the research had its own satisfactions, more the crystallization of it, the moment when a name stopped being an inclination and became a certainty. It was not emotional. It was more like the feeling of a lock giving way, a clean mechanical resolution after the careful application of the right pressure. He began the approach on a Saturday morning in early April. He had engineered the approach the same way he engineered most things. Plausibly, simply, without leaving edges. He had identified the plant nursery in Roslindale through a detail Ruth had apparently mentioned to Gerald, who had mentioned it to the group as an example of Ruth finding small anchors in routine. Marcus had gone to the nursery on a Friday afternoon, bought a small pot of rosemary, and taken note of the staff. Ruth had been behind the counter, a slight woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back and the particular quality of stillness that long grief gave people. She had rung up his purchase without much conversation. He had thanked her and left. The second visit was the following Saturday. He bought a small succulent and asked, with genuine appearing curiosity, whether she could recommend something low maintenance for a north-facing window in an apartment with inconsistent light. She had known immediately, the way people who loved plants knew, and had spent 4 minutes walking him through 3 options, with a focus and animation that softened the stillness in her face. He had thanked her again and said he would think about it and come back. The third visit he brought a question he had prepared specifically to extend the conversation. She answered it, and then, because this was how loneliness worked in people who had been lonely long enough to forget they were allowed to speak, She added something unprompted about the plant he had purchased on his first visit, whether the rosemary was doing well. He told her it was on his kitchen windowsill and that he talked to it occasionally when the apartment was too quiet, which was a thing he had calculated she would find both funny and recognizable. She laughed, small and brief but real. He smiled and introduced himself as Daniel. By the fourth visit, she recognized him when he came through the door and said his name first. And he watched something ease slightly in her posture, the way it eased in people, when they encountered a familiar face in the middle of an ordinary day. And he noted it with the cool, detached precision of a man cataloging data rather than experiencing a human moment. He was not Daniel, of course. He was never Daniel in the basement on Medford Street, or in his apartment on Commonwealth Avenue, or in Suite 204 on Newberry Street. Daniel was a coat he put on and took off without residue. Marcus Hale was very good at coats. The Tuesday session that week had a particular texture that Donnie noticed and filed away without yet knowing what to do with. Carol was visibly worse. Trevor had now been missing for 4 weeks, and the police had upgraded her inquiry to a formal missing persons report, though the detective assigned had communicated, in the careful language of someone managing expectations, that adult disappearances without evidence of foul play were difficult cases with low clearance rates. Carol had received this information and arrived at the session carrying it like something too heavy and too sharp to put down. Marcus handled her with extraordinary care, the kind of focused, sustained therapeutic attention that Donnie had seen maybe twice in her training, the kind that required genuine skill and total presence. He held the space around Carol's devastation without collapsing it, walked her from the raw edge of panic towards something that was not peace exactly, but was at least breathable. The group gathered around her, in the way good groups did. Frank's hand briefly on her arm, Priya's eyes full and present, Gerald speaking once, quietly, about knowing that particular waiting. Donnie found herself moved in spite of herself. Afterward she lingered while the others filed out and helped Marcus stack the extra chairs against the wall. It was the third time she had done this without planning to, she noticed. The chair stacking was not her responsibility. She kept finding reasons to stay. Carol's going to need more support than the group can hold, she said. I've already reached out about moving her to twice-weekly individual sessions, Marcus said. He lifted 2 chairs at once with easy efficiency. She needs a container with fewer variables right now. Do you ever take it home, Donnie asked, the weight of it, especially cases like Carol's. He considered this with the measured pause she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Not the pause of someone searching for an answer, but the pause of someone deciding which true thing to offer. I used to, he said. Early in my practice, I thought caring it was the proof of caring, that if I went home feeling fine, I must be doing something wrong. He set the last chair against the wall and turned to face her. I learned eventually that you serve people better from solid ground than from inside their flood with them. The goal is to be the bank, not the water. Donnie nodded slowly. It was again genuinely good clinical wisdom, the kind she would have written down and kept if she had been taking notes. That's well said, she told him. It took a long time to learn. He picked up his coat from the hook by the door, the brown one. He looked at it for a moment before putting it on. A fraction of a second longer than necessary, and then it was on, and he was buttoning it, and the moment was gone. You're doing well, Donnie. The group responds to you. Frank trusts you already, which is not a small thing. He doesn't trust easily. She felt the warmth of that, and also, somewhere beneath it, the faint, unnameable discomfort she always felt when Marcus was kind to her, as though the kindness had been measured out in precise proportion, as though someone had calculated the exact dose. She told herself she was tired. She went home in the rain, on Perkins Street in Jamaica Plain, in a third-floor apartment with window boxes of dying plants. Ruth Callahan was on the phone with her sister in Portland, describing a man she had met at the nursery. His name was Daniel. He was quiet and thoughtful, and he had lost someone too. She could tell, though he hadn't said so directly. He came in every Saturday now. It's nothing, Ruth said, in the tone of someone hoping to be contradicted. He's just a regular customer. Her sister said that was nice, that it was good she was talking to people, that she sounded a little more like herself lately. Ruth said maybe. She looked out the window at the wet street below, the headlights of passing cars catching the puddles and flaring briefly, and she felt something she had not felt in 14 months. Not happiness exactly. More like the first thin warmth of a sun you had stopped expecting. 3 weeks later she would be gone. Act 2, Session 2. What Daniel did last Saturday, Ruth Callahan worked at the nursery in Roslindale, was the 14th of April. She remembered it afterward in the brief window when there was still an afterward. Because Mai had brought in a flat of early dahlias that morning and the whole front room had smelled extraordinary, green and sweet and faintly of wet earth. and Ruth had stood in the middle of it for a moment, with her eyes closed, and thought that this was the kind of small, perfect thing David would have called her over to share. Daniel came in at 10:30. He bought a small pot of mint and asked about the dahlias, and Ruth told him everything she knew about them, which was considerable, and he listened with the focused attention he always brought, the kind that made you feel like what you were saying was the most interesting thing being said anywhere in the city at that particular moment. She had begun to look forward to Saturdays in a way she had not looked forward to anything in over a year. She had told her sister it was nothing, and had half believed it herself, and had known, in the quieter part of herself, that it was not quite nothing. He asked at the end of the visit whether she might want to have coffee sometime. Not as anything, he said, with a small self-deprecating gesture, just as two people who had both gotten used to too much quiet. Ruth said yes before she finished thinking about whether to. They met the following Wednesday evening at a small cafe on Center Street, 3 blocks from her apartment. He was already there when she arrived, which she liked. They talked for 2 hours, without either of them seeming to notice the time passing, which she liked more. He told her carefully and without self-pity that he had lost someone close several years ago, and had spent a long time afterward not knowing what to do with the version of himself that remained. He did not elaborate, and she did not push. She understood the grammar of that kind of loss. You said enough to let the other person know you were speaking the same language, and you left the rest where it lived. She walked home feeling lighter than she had in months. She stood at her kitchen window with a cup of tea and looked out at the wet street and let herself feel it without immediately explaining it away. Marcus walked back to his car, which he had parked 4 streets over, and sat in it for a moment in the dark. He noted with clinical precision that Ruth Callahan was going to be easy to move and difficult to account for because she was exactly the kind of person who disappeared without generating immediate alarm, isolated enough that gaps in contact would not be noticed quickly, connected enough through Gerald and the nursery and her sister's occasional calls that her absence would eventually become a problem if he was not careful about the timeline. He set the timeline at 10 days. He had learned over the years that 10 days was the productive window, long enough to allow for the logistics, short enough that the trail between the last confirmed sighting and the disappearance remained cold. He drove home on the expressway with the radio off and the wipers on, and the particular internal quiet that accompanied the early stages of a completed decision. The coffee on Wednesday had been the last step in a process that had begun 6 weeks earlier with a name in a journal and a small circle and the slow, patient work of becoming someone Ruth Callahan trusted. He had done it before, he would do it again. The specific details changed, but the architecture was always the same. Find the isolated one, become familiar, become safe. Let their own loneliness do most of the work the people wanted so badly to trust someone. That was the thing civilians never understood when they read about cases like his. When they asked the rhetorical question of how anyone could fall for it, they fell for it because the alternative, the life lived entirely behind glass, permanently defended against warmth, was worse than the risk. People were built for connection the way they were built for air. Deprive them long enough and they would breathe anything. He saw Ruth twice more in the 10-day window, once for a walk along the Jamaica Pond path on a gray Sunday afternoon, during which she told him about David in the careful, incremental way of someone testing whether the telling was safe. He listened with perfect attention and said the right things at the right moments and felt nothing except the clean operational satisfaction of the plan proceeding correctly. Once more for dinner at a small Italian place on Elm Street where she laughed 3 times. Real laughter, unguarded, and looked, for the space of an evening, like a woman who was returning to something she had been afraid she had lost permanently. He walked her back to her building on Perkins Street. She thanked him for the evening. He said it was his pleasure and meant it in the way he meant most things, which was technically and without content. She went upstairs. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the 3rd-floor windows, noted the light come on in the kitchen, and walked back to his car. He gave it 3 more days dawn a Thursday evening, 12 days after their first coffee and 8 days after the walk around Jamaica Pond. Marcus sent Ruth a text from the prepaid phone he kept for this specific purpose, a phone registered to Daniel Marsh at an address in Quincy that did not exist. He asked if she wanted to see a film Friday evening, something playing at the College Corner Theater that he thought she might enjoy. She said yes immediately. The 3 dots appeared, and then the message came through and he looked at it without expression and set the phone down and went to make tea. Friday arrived gray and cold and wet, which Marcus noted with the small private satisfaction that rain always produced in him. He picked Ruth up at 7, which she had suggested because it was easier than meeting somewhere, and which he had agreed to for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience. She was wearing a blue coat he had not seen before. She looked, in the light of the building's entrance, like a woman who had taken care getting ready, like someone who still believed the evening held ordinary possibilities. He smiled and said she looked well and held the door of the car open, and she got in. They did not go to the College Corner Theater. He drove north on the expressway with the radio playing low and Ruth talking about a documentary she had watched recently, and he answered in the right places and kept his eyes on the road and took the Charlestown exit at a pace and manner that attracted no attention from anyone. She noticed the route was wrong somewhere around the third turn. He heard it in her voice, the first small note of uncertainty threading into her sentence, the question forming before she had decided to ask it. "This isn't," she started. "Shortcut," he said. "Calm, easy." The voice from Suite 204. She accepted it for another 40 seconds, which was how long it took to reach Medford Street, long enough. He pulled into the narrow alley behind the building and cut the engine. The silence lasted one full second before Ruth understood that the silence was wrong. She reached for the door handle. He was faster. He had always been faster. The thing most people did not understand about violence, real violence, the kind that was not performed for an audience but executed for a purpose, was that it did not announce itself. There was no escalation of menace, no cinematic pause. There was only the moment before and the moment after, and the transition between them so swift and absolute that the mind could not fully process it in real time. Ruth fought, that registered in the part of Marcus that cataloged such things. She was not a large woman, but she was present in her body in the way people who worked with their hands tended to be, and she fought with the desperate, uncalculated energy of someone who had decided in a single clarifying instant that nothing in her life mattered as much as the next breath. Her elbow connected with his jaw hard enough to snap his head sideways. Her fingernails opened 3 lines down his left forearm, before he controlled both her wrists. She screamed once, sharp and high, before he prevented further sound. He absorbed all of it with the methodical patience of someone managing a variable he had anticipated. He got her inside. The basement on Medford Street received them the way it always did, indifferent, sealed. The single overhead bulb throwing its flat yellow light across bare concrete and brick. What happened in the following 40 minutes was not clean. Marcus had accepted years ago that clean was an aspiration rather than a guarantee, that the variables of a living human being resisting with everything available to them introduced a degree of chaos that planning could minimize but never fully eliminate. He had learned to work within the chaos without being consumed by it. To remain, even in the worst of it, the most functional person in the room. Ruth did not stop fighting until she could not fight anymore. He did not hurry her. The details of it lived in the room, the way the details always lived in the room, in the smell of copper and concrete and the industrial cleaner he would apply afterward, in the small specific wreckage of a life reduced to its most fundamental components. He moved through the aftermath with the practiced efficiency of long habit, the plastic sheeting, the contractor bags, the methodical inventory of every surface, every corner, every possible trace. The blue coat he handled separately. Personal items required additional step. He worked until midnight. He cleaned until 1. He conducted his final walkthrough at 1:15, stood in the dark for his customary moment of stillness, and felt the clean, settled quiet of completion. Outside, the rain had intensified. It came down in straight, cold lines, hammering the alley, filling the gutters, washing the streets of Charlestown with impersonal efficiency. Marcus buttoned his coat and stepped out into it and drove home on empty roads with the wipers on and the radio off, and the particular interior silence of a man who had done what he came to do and left nothing behind. On Sunday morning, Gerald knocked twice on the door of apartment 3C. He stood in the hallway for longer than usual, listening. He knocked again. He told himself Ruth was probably at the nursery, though Sunday was not one of her days. He told himself she had maybe gone to visit her sister in Portland. He stood in the hallway for another moment, the unease in him formless and without evidence, the kind of feeling you talked yourself out of because feelings without evidence were just anxiety. And anxiety was not a reason to bother anyone. He went back downstairs. He would mention it to the group on Tuesday, casually. Not wanting to make a thing of it, Marcus on Tuesday would listen with warm and patient attention and suggest, gently, that Gerald might want to try calling Ruth's sister in Portland, just to check in, just to be sure. He would say it the way he said everything, like a man who cared, like a shepherd counting his flock and finding the number exactly right. Act 2, Session 3, 43 degrees, and raining. Gerald brought it up 11 minutes into the session. He had been holding it the whole time, Donnie could tell. He had settled into his chair with the careful deliberateness she had come to associate with him, had accepted the tea Marcus offered, had listened to Priya describe a difficult week with the surface attention of someone whose mind was partly elsewhere. When the group reached one of its natural breathing pauses, the kind that opened up between one person's sharing and the next, Gerald set his cup down and said, in his measured, unhurried way, that he was a little worried about his neighbor, Ruth. The room received this with the particular quality of attention that groups developed over time, a collective leaning in that was not physical but was entirely felt. Gerald described the unanswered knock on Sunday, the nursery, where he had called Monday morning and been told by a woman who was not Mai that Ruth had not come in and had not called. The text message he had sent Tuesday afternoon that showed delivered but not read. He described all of it in the same tone he used for everything, careful and unembellished, and then he looked at his hands and said he was probably making too much of it. "You're not making too much of it," Carol said immediately. The sharpness in her voice surprised the room. She had the particular sensitivity of someone already living inside the version of this story where the worst was true. "You call the police, Gerald. Today. You don't wait." The group shifted. Priya looked between Carol and Gerald. Frank was very still in the particular way. He was still when he was paying close attention to something he had not yet decided how to name. Marcus let the moment breathe for exactly the right number of seconds before he spoke. "Carol's right that acting on concern is always better than waiting," he said, his voice carrying its customary warmth and steadiness. "Gerald, do you know if Ruth has family she might have gone to visit? Sometimes people in grief take unannounced trips. The need to be somewhere else can arrive suddenly." Gerald said her sister was in Portland. He had not called the sister. He had not wanted to alarm anyone. "It might be worth a call," Marcus said, "just to set your mind at ease. If she's not there and there's been no contact, then a welfare check through the police is absolutely the right step. You know, Ruth, trust what you know." It was, Donnie thought, exactly the right clinical response. Validating without catastrophizing, actionable without alarming. She wrote it down in her notes because it was the kind of facilitation technique she wanted to remember. She watched Frank watching Marcus. Frank had not said anything yet. This was not unusual. Frank rarely spoke early in a thread. He was a listener first, the kind of man who gathered information before committing to a position, and his silences were never empty. But there was a quality to his attention tonight that Donnie had not observed before. Not suspicion exactly, more like recognition. The way a person looked when something confirmed a thing they had been carrying quietly and had not yet given language to. He caught her eye briefly across the circle. Something passed between them that was not quite communication and not quite nothing. The session moved forward. Priya had news of her own, a small one. She had gone through her mother's recipe box that week, and instead of the expected devastation had found something closer to comfort in the familiar handwriting on the index cards, the specific abbreviations her mother used, the margins filled with small notes in pencil. She described it with a tentative wonder, as though she was not entirely sure she was allowed to have received it as a good thing. "You are allowed," Marcus said quietly. "Grief doesn't require you to refuse the good things. It just asks you to let them coexist with the loss. Which is harder than it sounds and exactly what you did." Priya nodded, eyes bright. Donnie believed him completely in that moment. That was the thing she kept returning to. In her apartment late at night, when the session replayed in her mind with the particular clarity that came from having been genuinely present rather than merely observant, she believed him. His warmth landed as real. His wisdom felt earned rather than performed. Every instinct she had developed over years of training and practice registered Marcus Hale as a good man doing difficult work with uncommon skill, and yet the feeling she could not name was still there, still formless, still without evidence. She stayed after, as she had developed a habit of doing, and helped with the chairs. Frank stayed too, which was new. He moved to the chair stacking with the easy efficiency of someone who had spent time in spaces where tasks were shared without being assigned, and the three of them worked in a companionable quiet for a moment before Frank said, without particular emphasis, "That's the second person connected to this group who's gone quiet in 2 months." Donnie went still with a chair in her hands. Marcus did not go still. He turned to Frank with an expression of thoughtful acknowledgement, the look of a clinician receiving an observation rather than a challenge. "Trevor and now possibly Ruth," he said, "though Ruth isn't a group member." "No," Frank said. "She's Gerald's neighbor." Who Gerald mentioned here. He set a chair against the wall. "I'm probably connecting dots that aren't connected." "It's natural to look for patterns when you're surrounded by loss," Marcus said. "It's how the mind tries to make the uncontrollable feel manageable." Frank looked at him for a moment. "Sure," he said, not disagreeing. Not agreeing either. Just the word, flat and complete. The way a man used a word when he was deciding how much further to take something in a given moment. He said goodnight to both of them and left. Donnie finished stacking her chairs. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not usually aware of it. Frank's observation sat in her chest like a stone she had not known she was carrying, until someone else picked it up and showed it to her. 2 people, connected to the group, gone quiet within 2 months. She told herself it was coincidence. Boston was a city of 700,000 people, and coincidences happened in cities the way they happened everywhere, with more frequency than pattern-seeking minds found comfortable. Trevor had been struggling before he disappeared. Ruth might be in Portland. Gerald's concern might resolve itself with a phone call tomorrow morning. She reached for her coat. "You're quiet," Marcus said. He was at the window, looking out at the rain. He had not put his coat on yet. "Frank's observation," she said. "I know it's probably nothing." "It probably is," Marcus said. He turned from the window. In the amber light of the floor lamps, his face was calm and open and entirely readable, which was, though she would not understand this until much later, precisely the point. An unreadable face attracted attention. A readable face, warm and present and slightly tired in the way of a man who cared deeply about his work, attracted nothing but trust. But it's worth sitting with. That's what we do in this field. We sit with the uncomfortable thing until it either resolves or it doesn't. Rushing that process never helps. Donnie nodded. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep. You've been taking this work seriously, and that's good, but you also need to be able to put it down," she said goodnight. She took the stairs down to the street and pushed out into the cold, wet April air and stood for a moment on the Newbury Street sidewalk with the rain coming down and the amber light from the second-floor windows of Suite 204 falling in a long rectangle on the wet pavement at her feet. Above her, she did not see Marcus move to stand at the window and watch her walk south toward the Boylston Street. Stop with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression unchanged from the warm, attentive look he had worn for the past 90 minutes. She did not see him watch her until she rounded the corner and was gone. She did not see him take his phone from his pocket and open the Notes app and type, with 2 unhurried thumbs, a single line. She did not see any of this because she was already gone. She was thinking about Frank, about the flat, complete sound of his sure, about 2 names and 2 disappearances, and a feeling she could not name, and a man whose compassion was structurally perfect and had no heat. She was thinking that she was probably overthinking. She was thinking that she should call her own supervisor tomorrow and talk it through. She was thinking as she descended into the orange glow of the Boylston Street station, with the rain disappearing behind her and the warm tunnel air rising to meet her, that she was tired and it had been a long week and she would feel better after sleep. She did not think about the note Marcus had just typed into his phone. She had seen it, she would not have slept at all. Adi read, "Donnie rise. Instincts good. Self-doubt still buffer. Monitor." 3 days later, Gerald called Ruth's sister in Portland. The sister had not heard from Ruth in 11 days. She had assumed Ruth was simply having a hard week and had not wanted to hover. Gerald called the Boston Police Department non-emergency line at 9:14 on a Friday morning and requested a welfare check on a resident of 3C at a building on Perkins Street in Jamaica Plain. The officer who took the call was patient and thorough and explained that a welfare check would be conducted within 24 to 48 hours and that if Gerald had additional concerns he could file a formal missing persons report, which required the individual to have been missing for a period of time consistent with department guidelines, and which Gerald could initiate at any district station. Gerald thanked him and hung up and sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He was 64 years old. He had spent 22 years as a Boston police detective before his knees and his conscience had reached a mutual agreement that it was time to stop. He had worked missing persons cases. He had worked homicides. He had developed, over 2 decades, a sense for the shape of things that he could not fully explain to anyone who had not developed it themselves. The shape of this felt wrong. He wrote down the date and time of his call in a small spiral notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer, the habit of documentation so deeply ingrained that he did not even register doing it. Then he wrote down the date of his last confirmed contact with Ruth. Then, after a pause, he wrote down the name of the support group he attended and the name of its facilitator. He looked at what he had written. He tapped his pen twice against the notebook. Then he turned to a fresh page and wrote Trevor Paulson at the top and sat very still for a long time in his quiet kitchen while the Friday morning light moved across the table and the city went about its ordinary business outside his window. Act 2, Session 4. Coelho detective Raymond Coelho had a desk on the second floor of District B2 in Roxbury that looked, to the untrained eye, like the aftermath of a small explosion in a paper factory. To Coelho it was a filing system. Every report, every note, every photograph and printout occupied a position in a spatial logic that existed entirely in his head and that he could navigate with his eyes half closed at 7 in the morning on 3 hours of sleep, which was frequently the condition in which he operated. He was 51 years old, Portuguese on his father's side and Cape Verdean on his mother's, with the particular face of a man who had spent decades listening to people describe terrible things and had never quite developed the protective indifference that was supposed to come with the territory. His wife Rosa said it was why she had married him and also why she worried about him constantly, both of which he accepted as accurate. He caught the Ruth Callahan welfare check on a Tuesday morning when it escalated from a standard check to a missing persons report. The patrol officer who had conducted the welfare check had found the apartment locked, no response, no signs of disturbance visible through the window, neighbor Gerald Calhoun on site and visibly concerned. Standard protocol, except that the neighbor, Gerald Calhoun, had asked to speak to a detective specifically and had used language that patrol had flagged in their notes. The language was, "This may be connected to another disappearance." Coelho read the flag, looked at his desk, looked at his coffee, and picked up his phone. Gerald met him at the building on Perkins Street at 11 that morning. He was a large, deliberate man who moved and spoke with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that most situations did not improve with haste. He shook Coelho's hand on the front steps and looked him over in a way that was not unfriendly but was entirely professional, the assessment of one practitioner evaluating another. "You worked the job," Coelho said. "It was not a question." 22 years, Gerald said. B3, then homicide, then missing persons the last 6 years before I retired. Coelho nodded once, the particular nod of a man recalibrating the conversation he had been prepared to have. "Tell me about your neighbor." Gerald told him about Ruth with the precise, unhurried detail of a man who had spent decades giving statements and taking them. The 14 months of widowhood, the narrow support network, the nursery in Roslindale, the unannounced disappearance with no contact to family or employer, the welfare check producing no response and no visible disturbance. He delivered all of it without editorializing, and then, when the factual account was complete, he paused. "There's something else," Coelho said. Gerald reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He handed it over with the careful deliberateness of a man who had thought about whether to do this and had decided. Coelho unfolded it. A handwritten list. 2 names at the top, Trevor Paulson and Ruth Callahan. Below them, a single line of context for each. Below that, a third line that read, "Both connected to Mending Boston Support Group, facilitator Dr. Marcus Hale, Suite 204, Newbury Street." Coelho read it twice. He refolded it along its original creases. "You're a member of this group," he said. 11 months, Gerald said. "And you think the facilitator is connected?" Gerald was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not uncertainty but precision. "I think 2 people connected to the same small support group have disappeared within 2 months of each other, and that I don't have enough information yet to think anything beyond that. I'm giving you what I have." Coelho looked at the building 3rd floor window. "Dead plants in the boxes. The Paulson case is out of B2, he said. "Different district." "I know," Gerald said. "I'll make a call." Gerald nodded. He looked up at Ruth's window for a moment, and then back at Coelho with the expression of a man who had filed his report and had no illusions about what filing a report did and did not guarantee. "She was doing better," he said. "The last few weeks, she seemed lighter. She mentioned meeting someone." Coelho looked at him. "Someone, a man. At the nursery where she worked, she didn't give me a name. Just said he was quiet and thoughtful and that he had lost someone too." Gerald paused. "I didn't think to ask more at the time." Coelho wrote in his notebook. He wrote quietly and thoughtful and lost someone, and then underlined the last 2 words once. "I'll be in touch, Mr. Calhoun." Gerald. Coelho shook his hand again. "Don't go anywhere with this in the meantime, you know why." Gerald knew why. "You didn't build a case by talking about building a case. You built it by being quiet and keeping notes and letting the other side believe they were invisible until they weren't." He had spent 22 years doing exactly that, and he was not about to stop now. He went upstairs. Coelho stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at the building, and then at his notebook, and then at the name Marcus Hale written in his own handwriting, and underlined once, without being entirely sure when he had underlined it. He called B6 from the car. The Trevor Paulson case had gone cold after 3 weeks of light investigation. Adult male, no evidence of foul play, history of social withdrawal post-divorce. The detective who had handled it, a woman named Salgado, who Coelho respected, had run the standard checks and found nothing actionable. She listened to Coelho's summary with the focused attention of someone who had not stopped thinking about a cold case just because it was cold. "The support group connection is thin," she said. "It's thin," Coelho agreed. "You want me to send you what I have on Paulson?" "I do. You think it's something?" Coelho looked at Gerald Callan's handwritten list on the passenger seat. 2 names, 1 facilitator, 1 address on Newbury Street. "I think it's worth a conversation," he said. "Nothing more than that yet." Salgado said she would send the file by end of day. She said it in the tone of someone who was already pulling it up. Marcus spent Tuesday morning in individual session with Priya. whose grief was beginning the slow, difficult process of integrating rather than simply enduring. It was good clinical work, the kind that required sustained attention and genuine skill, and Marcus brought both because the work itself was one of the few things he engaged with that was not entirely instrumental. He was good at it in the way a surgeon was good at surgery. Not because he felt what his patients felt, but because the mechanics of it interested him, and because being good at things was, in itself, a form of satisfaction. After Priya, he had a 45-minute gap before his next individual client. He spent it at his desk reviewing his journal. He had added a fourth name to his working list the previous week. Not from the group directly. From Donnie. She had mentioned in one of their post-session conversations, a colleague at Boston Family Services named Patrick, who was going through a difficult period following the death of his father. She had mentioned it in the context of discussing complicated grief presentations, professionally and without any sense that she was offering anything beyond a clinical observation. She had mentioned his first name only, his general workplace, the broad outlines of his situation. Marcus had written Patrick, Boston Family Services, paternal loss, isolated at work in his journal that evening, and placed a small circle beside it. He had not yet decided, the timeline required space between selections, and he was currently still within the window of Ruth's disappearance. But the name was there, the circle was there. Patience was not deprivation, it was inventory. He closed the journal and placed it beside his session notes and went to make T.IT for that afternoon. Donnie stopped by Suite 204 to drop off some referral paperwork that could have been emailed, but that she had printed and brought in person, a habit she had developed over the past 3 weeks that she had not fully examined. Marcus was between clients. He waved her in, and they stood at the small table by the window for 10 minutes with cups of tea, talking about the group, about Priya's progress, about Gerald's concern for Ruth. "Gerald called me this morning," Donnie said. "He filed a missing persons report. He's worried. He should be," Marcus said. "His instincts about people are good. It's one of the things that makes him valuable to the group." He paused, looking out the window at the street below. "I hope she's simply somewhere she needs to be. Sometimes the people around us disappear for reasons that have nothing to do with anything we could have anticipated or prevented." The sentence landed with the gentle authority of clinical wisdom. Donnie received it that way. She did not hear, in it, the careful engineering of a man constructing the exact narrative he needed her to carry. "How are you doing with all of it?" Marcus asked. He turned from the window and looked at her with the full warmth of his attention. 2 concerning situations in one group in 2 months. That's a heavy load for a co-facilitator still finding her footing. "I'm okay," she said, and then, because he was looking at her with a particular quality of attention that made honesty feel safe, she said, "I'm a little unsettled. I can't fully explain why." "You don't have to explain it," he said. "Sit with it. You have good instincts. They're working on something. Let them work." It was the most dangerous thing he could have said to her, and he knew it. He said it because the alternative, dismissing her instincts, redirecting her attention, creating distance, would register as wrong to someone as perceptive as she was. The far safer move was to validate the instinct while making her feel that he was the one person in her world who understood and supported it. If she trusted him with her unease, she would not take her unease elsewhere. Not yet. Not while the self-doubt held. He handed her the referral paperwork receipt and walked her to the door and said he would see her Tuesday. She went down the stairs and out into the cold afternoon feeling obscurely better. He stood at the door for a moment after it closed, and his expression did not change because his expression was a tool, and tools did not change when not in use. He went back to his desk. He opened his journal. He drew a small circle beside Patrick's name and then, after a moment's consideration, added one word beneath it. Soon. Frank Caruso spent Tuesday evening at his kitchen table in his apartment in West Roxbury with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold while he wrote. He had been doing this every evening for 9 days, building the thing the way he had built every case he had ever worked, which was from the bottom, from the smallest observable facts, without assumption or conclusion until the facts themselves demanded one. He had 2 columns, what he knew, what he did not know. What he knew was narrow and specific. Trevor Paulson had disappeared approximately 8 weeks ago. Trevor was Carol's brother. Carol had mentioned Trevor in group session multiple times before his disappearance. Ruth Callahan had disappeared within the past 2 weeks. Ruth was Gerald's neighbor. Gerald had mentioned Ruth in group session. Both disappearances had occurred within the orbit of Mending Boston. What he did not know was everything else. He stared at the 2 columns for a long time. He had been a detective long enough to know that 2 data points were not a pattern. They were a coincidence until they weren't. The mind imposed pattern on coincidence because it was built to do so. He had seen good investigators destroy good cases by falling in love with a theory before the facts could support it. He picked up his pen. He wrote a third column headed Marcus Hale. Under it he wrote, knows details of members' personal networks, knows who is isolated, knows who has peripheral connections, present for both disappearances, trusted completely by all members. He looked at what he had written. He picked up his coffee and found it cold and drank it anyway. He had not been to see a doctor about his knees in 8 months because every time he made the appointment, something came up and he canceled it. Rosa, before she died, had called it a character defect. He called it prioritization. The distinction had been one of their longest-running disagreements, and one of the things he missed most about her, the specific texture of an argument with someone who knew you well enough to be right about you. He wrote one more line at the bottom of the Marcus Hale column. He wrote, do not approach, do not signal, watch only. He underlined it twice. Then he closed the legal pad and rinsed his cup and went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time listening to the rain that had started up again outside his window, steady and cold and indifferent, the way Boston rain always was in April, as though the city itself was withholding judgment. Act 2, Session 5. The third Namathi Salgado file arrived on Coelho's desk Wednesday morning in a manila folder that was thinner than he had hoped and thicker than he had expected. He cleared a space among the paper archaeology of his workspace, poured coffee that was already 2 hours old, and read it straight through without stopping. Trevor Paulson, 41, divorced. Last confirmed contact with his sister Carol Weaver on a Tuesday evening, approximately 8 weeks prior. No financial activity on any known accounts since that date, no phone activity, no confirmed sightings. Investigation had produced no witnesses, no evidence of foul play, no leads of sufficient substance to keep the case active. Status open, inactive. The file was clean and thorough, and led precisely nowhere. Coelho set it down and picked up the legal pad where he had been building his own preliminary notes, and looked at the two names sitting at the top of the page, Paulson Callahan. He drew a line connecting them, and at the midpoint of the line wrote the words Mending Boston and circled it. Then he opened his laptop and ran Marcus Ellen Hale. What came back was unremarkable in the specific way that concerned experienced investigators, a clean record. A valid LMC license issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, current no disciplinary actions. A practice history that tracked backward cleanly through Mass General's grief support program, through graduate training at Boston University, through an undergraduate degree at the University of Vermont, a sparse online presence, no social media, a minimal practice website with a brief professional biography and a contact form. A man who existed exactly as much as he needed to exist and not one detail more. Coelho stared at the screen for a long moment. Most people left more, not criminal records necessarily, just texture, the ambient residue of a life. Alumni pages, local news mentions, neighborhood association rosters, the small digital fingerprints of someone moving through the world. Marcus Hale's digital footprint was not suspicious in any specific way. It was just very, very clean. He called Salgado. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear the particular background quality of a detective's bullpen behind her, phones and keyboards, and the low continuous frequency of institutional fluorescent lighting. I found something, she said before he could speak. Or something that might be something. I've been running Paulson's case history backward, and I found a name from 3 years ago. Diane Marsh, 58, widowed, disappeared from her apartment in Dorchester. Cold case, never cleared, no body recovered. Coelho was quiet. She was in a grief support group, Salgado said. Let me guess, Coelho said. Different group, different address, but the facilitator's name in the intake paperwork is listed as Dr. M. Hale. Consulting, a pause. It may be nothing. Consulting clinicians rotate through multiple programs. It may be nothing, Coelho agreed, in the tone of a man who did not think it was nothing. I'm pulling everything on Diane Marsh. Give me until Friday. Pull everything, Coelho said. He looked at his legal pad. 3 names now, Marsh, Paulson, Callahan. A cold case 3 years old, a fresh disappearance 2 months ago, and a woman missing since last Friday, all of them connected at varying distances to a quiet man in a brown cardigan on Newbury Street, who had a very clean record and a very clean digital footprint, and a very precise way of knowing exactly which of his clients were most alone in the world. He added Diane Marsh to his legal pad. He drew a line from her name to the circle that said Mending Boston. Then he sat back and drank his cold coffee and thought about the phrase Gerald Calhoun had used on the front steps of the Perkins Street building. She seemed lighter. She mentioned meeting someone, quiet, thoughtful. Lost someone too, he wrote, unknown male contact, nursery, Roslindale. No name. Confirm with employer, he underlined it once. He reached for his phone. Frank had been watching the Newbury Street building on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for 2 weeks. Not the building exactly, the block. He walked it the way he used to walk surveillance, casually, with somewhere to be and nothing particular to look at. A man taking the air between a coffee shop on Boylston and wherever a man his age might be going on a weeknight. His knees complained about the third lap on cold evenings. He told his knees what he had told them for 30 years, and they registered their objection, and he continued anyway. He was not sure what he was looking for. That was honest. He was looking for the thing he would know when he saw it, which was not good investigative practice, and which he would have told any young detective who tried it on his watch. But he was not a young detective, and this was not his watch, and the rigorous standards of evidence gathering that governed professional investigation did not govern a 64-year-old man walking a public sidewalk on his own time. What he saw on the second Thursday was Marcus leaving the building at 8:47 in a brown coat, walking south on Newberry, and meeting a young woman at the corner of Dartmouth Street. They stood and talked for 4 minutes. Frank, a half-block north on the opposite side of the street, watched with the still unhurried attention of someone reading a bus schedule. The young woman was Donnie Rye-Eyes. He recognized her immediately. She had been in the group since April, co-facilitating, careful and perceptive, and visibly still finding her footing. Frank liked her. She reminded him of the best young detectives he had worked with, the ones who trusted their instincts and doubted their conclusions in exactly the right proportions. He watched Marcus and Donnie talk. Their body language was collegial, nothing inappropriate. Marcus was doing the thing Frank had observed him do in group, the slight incline of the head, the focused attention, the posture of a man who was entirely present. Donnie was responding the way everyone responded to it, relaxing into it, turning toward it the way a plant turned toward light. Frank watched Marcus watch Donnie after she turned to leave. The expression on Marcus's face during those unobserved seconds was not warm. It was not cold either. It was simply blank in the specific way of a man whose warmth was a costume he wore for an audience and removed when the audience was gone. Frank had seen that blankness before, not often. In interview rooms, across metal tables, looking at men who had done things that required a certain kind of interior absence to accomplish. He walked back to his car. He sat in it for a long time. Then he opened the glove compartment and took out the small notebook he had kept in every car he had ever owned, and he wrote down the date and time and what he had observed and a single name at the bottom of the entry. Raymond Coelho. B2, retired, asked Petrosian. He knew Petrosian from the old days, a desk sergeant at B2, who had been a desk sergeant at B2 for so long that he was essentially a geological feature of the building. Petrosian would know Coelho. Petrosian knew everyone. Frank started the car. He drove home in the rain. Patrick Dolan was 34 years old and worked as a case manager at Boston Family Services on Washington Street, which was how Donnie knew him, loosely, in the way you knew colleagues you passed in hallways and occasionally ate lunch near in the break room. He was quiet in the way of someone who had been outgoing before something changed, the conversational residue of a more social self still visible in the way he smiled before remembering not to. His father had died in February. He had not taken sufficient leave, which Donnie had mentioned to her supervisor, and which her supervisor had noted, and which had produced no particular action. Donnie had mentioned Patrick to Marcus in the abstract clinical way. She mentioned things she was professionally concerned about, the habit of a practitioner thinking out loud with a trusted colleague. She had not thought about it again. Marcus had thought about it every day since. He found Patrick the way he found everyone, carefully, patiently, through the small observable architecture of an ordinary life. Washington Street, break room lunch, the habitat of a grieving young man who had stopped going anywhere that required energy he no longer had. He walked into Boston Family Services on a Wednesday morning with a referral form for a fictional client that he had prepared on his practice letterhead, standard enough to pass a receptionist's attention, specific enough to require it to be walked to someone in intake rather than simply dropped in a box. He spent 4 minutes in the waiting area while the form was processed. Patrick walked through the waiting area at minute 3, coffee cup in hand, head down, the particular walk of someone navigating a hallway on autopilot. Marcus did not make eye contact, did not speak, did not register in any way that Patrick would notice or remember. He simply observed 34, medium height, the look of a man who had lost weight recently without intending to, the collar of his shirt slightly loose, the coffee cup held with both hands, the small self-comfort of warmth in the palms. Alone in a room full of colleagues in the specific way of grief, which created its own glass, clear and invisible and absolute, the form was returned to Marcus with a note that intake would be in touch within 5 to 7 business days. He thanked the receptionist and left. In his car he sat for a moment. He opened his journal to Patrick's page. The small circle was already there. The word soon was already there. He drew a line through soon. He wrote a date, 4 weeks out. He closed the journal and started the car and drove back to Newberry Street in the rain with the radio off and the wipers on and the clean interior quiet of a man who had found what he was looking for and could afford now to be patient. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Coelho had been at the nursery in Roslindale that morning, where Mai, who had managed the terse economy of her words into a precise and useful account, confirmed that Ruth had mentioned a regular customer named Daniel. That Daniel was a white male, approximately 50, slim, gray at the temples, brown coat. That Daniel had last been in the nursery the Saturday before Ruth's disappearance and had not returned since. Coelho had written every detail and thanked Mai and stood in the front room among the early dahlias that Ruth had loved and thought about a man named Daniel who was slim and gray at the temples and wore a brown coat and had never come back. He was back at his desk when his phone rang. Unknown number, Boston Exchange, Detective Coelho, he said, a pause, then a voice male, unhurried, with the careful measured quality of a man choosing his words the way a chess player chose a move. My name is Frank Caruso. I was a detective with BPD for 22 years. I retired 4 years ago. I think we may be looking at the same thing. Coelho leaned back in his chair. He looked at his legal pad. 3 names, 1 circle. A man in a brown coat named Daniel who had never come back. Tell me what you have, he said. Frank told him. It took 11 minutes. He delivered it in the sequential, unfussy way of a trained investigator. Facts in order, no speculation dressed as observation, the qualifications placed correctly and briefly. When he finished, there was a silence that was not empty. The co-facilitator, Coelho said, Donnie Reyes, how close is she to Hale? Close enough that I'm concerned, Frank said. She's perceptive and he knows it. He's managing her. Coelho wrote Donnie Reyes on the legal pad and put a box around it. Not a circle, a box. The distinction mattered to him in the private shorthand of his notation system. A circle meant a connection. A box meant a person who needed protecting. Don't approach her yet, Coelho said. And don't approach him, not under any circumstances. I know the protocol, Frank said. I know you do. I'm saying it anyway. Another brief silence. There's a third name, Coelho said. Diane Marsh, 3 years ago, Dorchester cold case. He heard Frank's breathing change slightly, the almost imperceptible shift of a man absorbing information and reorganizing around it. If the pattern holds, this goes back further than Paulson. Possibly much further. Frank was quiet for a long moment. How many, he said. It was not quite a question. I don't know yet, Coelho said. That's what I'm trying to find out. Outside the window of Frank's West Roxbury kitchen, the rain came down in steady, indifferent lines across the late afternoon light. He looked at his legal pad with its 2 columns and its third column headed Marcus Hale, and thought about the number of Tuesday evenings in 15 years of mending Boston, and the number of peripheral people mentioned in passing in a small warm room on Newbury Street, and felt the specific cold weight of a thing that was larger than he had let himself consider until this moment. Find out fast, Frank said. Coelho said he would. He hung up and immediately dialed Salgado. She answered on the first ring. Act 3, Session 1. The sister who wasn't the thing that broke it open was small. It was always something small. Donnie had not gone looking for it. That was the part she would return to afterward. In the long, difficult months of processing what she had been sitting 3 feet away from every Tuesday evening, she had not gone looking. She had been doing something entirely ordinary, updating her continuing education log for her licensure renewal, which required her to document supervised clinical hours and the professional context in which they had been accumulated. She needed the full legal name of the practice and its founding date for the state board paperwork. She went to the Mending Boston website. She had visited it once before, in the first week, when she had read Marcus's professional biography with the skimming attention of someone gathering basic orientation rather than conducting research. She read it again now with the slower attention of paperwork, which required actual retention. The biography was brief and polished. Graduate training at Boston University. Prior clinical work at Massachusetts General Hospital. 15 years in private practice. A founding philosophy rooted in the belief that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a relationship to be tended. And near the end, 2 sentences, the personal disclosure that anchored the whole professional narrative. Now my own path to this work began with loss. The death of my sister Catherine in 1999 taught me that grief without witness is the heaviest grief of all. Donnie read it twice. She had a specific memory of Marcus on the phone, 3 weeks into her placement, giving her background on the group members. She had asked about his sister. He had said yes in the quiet, complete way that invited no follow-up. She had not followed up. She thought now about the specific texture of that yes, the way it had functioned in the conversation, the way it had closed a door so gently that she had not registered the closing to Catherine. 1999, she told herself it meant nothing. People disclosed personal loss in professional biographies all the time. The fact that she had not known the name or the year was simply the result of her own incuriosity, which she could correct right now in 30 seconds by typing a name into a search field. She told herself that while she was already opening a new browser tab. Catherine Hale, Boston 1999, the search returned nothing specific. Not unusual. 1999 predated the comprehensive digitization of most local records, and the name was common enough to produce noise rather than signal. She tried variations. Catherine Hale, Massachusetts, 1999. Catherine Hale, obituary, 1999. Catherine Hale, death, 1999, Boston. Nothing that matched. She sat with that for a moment. The absence of a result was not the same as the absence of a person. Records from 1999 were incomplete online. Obituaries from that era were inconsistently digitized. A woman named Catherine Hale, who died in a New England city in 1999, might simply not be findable through a browser search conducted in 2024 by someone who did not know the full name, the city, or the cause of death. She told herself this. She opened the Massachusetts Vital Records database, which she had access to through her Boston Family Services credentials for legitimate case research purposes, and which she had never previously considered using for anything else. She searched for Catherine Hale, Massachusetts, death records, 1995 to 2003, giving the date a wide margin for the inexactness of the phrase 1999 in Marcus's biography, which might have meant the year of death or the year his grief had crystallized, or simply the year everything had changed. The search returned 4 Catherine Hales in Massachusetts death records in that window. She pulled each one. A Catherine Margaret Hale, 73, Worcester, 1997. A Catherine Ann Hale, 6 weeks old, Springfield, 2001. A Catherine Hale, 44, Pittsfield, 1999, because listed as cardiac event. And one more, a Catherine Rose Hale, 31, Boston, 1998, because listed as accident. Donnie stared at the 4th entry. Catherine Rose Hale, Boston, 1998, the right city, the right approximate era, the right name. She clicked through to the full record. Next of kin listed. Mother, Patricia Hale, address in Burlington, Vermont, father, deceased. No siblings listed. She read it again. No siblings listed. She sat very still at her desk for a long time. The apartment around her was quiet, in the way apartments were quiet late on a weeknight. The building's ordinary sounds receding into white noise. The street outside muffled by rain against the windows. No siblings listed. Edie could mean nothing. Records from 1998 were imperfect, and next of kin listings were notoriously incomplete depending on the clerk and the circumstances, and the family's engagement with the process. A brother estranged, a brother not contacted, a clerical omission of a dozen possible varieties could mean nothing. She closed the database, she opened it again, she searched for Marcus Ellen Hale, Massachusetts, birth records. He came back once. Marcus Ellen Hale, born 1974, Burlington, Vermont. Parents listed Patricia Hale and Robert Hale. She searched the same parents for additional children. Patricia Hale, Robert Hale, Burlington, Vermont. Children. One child listed. Marcus Ellen Hale, born 1974. She closed the laptop. She stood up from her desk and walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water and drank half of it standing at the sink, looking at the dark window above it. Her own reflection looking back at her with an expression she did not recognize. One child. No Catherine. She thought about everything she knew. The ways records failed. The ways families fractured and documents reflected only the version of a family that was visible to the state. Half-siblings. Adoptions. Estrangements that removed names from paperwork without removing people from lives. She thought about all of it, carefully and honestly, and with full acknowledgement of every reason the records might be wrong. And then she thought about the way Marcus had said yes on the phone when she had mentioned his sister, the way it had closed the door, the way it had been precisely calibrated to end inquiry without appearing to. She thought about the way his compassion had no heat. She thought about Trevor, about Ruth, about Frank's flat, unhurried sure, and the 2 names on his legal pad that she did not know about, and the retired detective's instinct that she did not know about, and the box that Coelho had drawn around her name that she did not know about. She knew none of that. She knew only that a man who had built his entire professional identity on the loss of a sister who did not appear in any birth or death record connected to his family had been sitting 3 feet away from her every Tuesday evening for 6 weeks. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She did not know who to call. Her supervisor would counsel caution and process and the proper channels, all of which were correct and none of which felt adequate to the specific quality of dread that had settled into her chest. She did not have a detective's number. She did not know Frank well enough to call him at 11 on a weeknight. With something that was still, technically, a records discrepancy and nothing more, she picked up her phone again. She put it in her pocket without dialing. She sat back down at her desk and opened her laptop and created a new document and began writing down everything she knew in the careful sequential way Marcus had taught her. Facts in order, qualifications placed correctly, no conclusion until the facts demanded one. She was still writing at 1 in the morning. She did not know that 30 blocks away Raymond Coelho was still at his desk doing the same thing. Salgado had spent 4 days on Diane Marsh. What she gave Coelho on Friday afternoon was not a folder, it was a box. A banker's box with a lid, the kind used for archiving cases that had been closed without resolution, set on his desk with the particular gravity of something that had been waiting a long time to be opened by the right person. Coelho looked at the box. "How far back?" he said. Salgado sat down across from his desk with her own coffee, which was also cold because cold coffee was the baseline condition of their profession. "Diane Marsh was 3 years ago," she said, "but when I started pulling the thread I found 2 more, both cold, both women, both widowed or otherwise isolated, both connected at varying degrees to grief support programming in the Boston area. Coelho did not touch the box yet. Name Susan Baymont, 6 years ago, Jamaica Plain, widowed, no children, sister in Ohio who reported her missing after 3 weeks of no contact. Case went nowhere." Salgado paused. "And before her, a woman named Helen Rourke, 9 years ago, Charlestown." Coelho looked up. "Charlestown," he said. "Charlestown," Salgado confirmed. "Rented a room, no family locally, worked part-time." The missing persons report was filed by her landlord after 2 missed rent payments. Case was investigated for 6 weeks and closed inactive. Coelho opened the box. The Rourke file was on top because Salgado had organized the box chronologically from oldest to newest, which was how she organized everything, and which Coelho appreciated without saying so. He lifted the file and opened it and read the first page. Helen Rourke, 52, Charlestown, missing 9 years ago, last confirmed contact, a Tuesday evening. He flipped to the investigative notes, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Adult female, isolated, history of depression following the death of her husband 4 years prior, had been attending a grief support group in the Back Bay area, which investigators had noted and then apparently not pursued. The notation sitting in the file like a door that had been identified and never opened. Coelho found the notation and read it twice. Grief support group, Back Bay. Name of group listed as Mending Boston. Facilitator not interviewed. Case closed inactive 42 days after report. He set the file down. He looked at the box. At the Beaumont file beneath the Rourke file and the Marsh file beneath that, and the Paulson folder from Salgado's own case and the Ruth Callahan report on his own desk. 5 names. 9 years, all of them isolated, all of them grieving. All of them connected at varying distances to a warm, quiet man in a brown cardigan on Newberry Street, who had a very clean record and a professional biography built on a loss that may not have existed. "There may be more," Salgado said quietly. "These are the ones I could connect. If he's been doing this for 15 years and he's been careful, Coelho said. She nodded. They sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the specific terrible arithmetic of 15 years and Tuesday evenings and a room full of people who trusted completely. "I need to move carefully," Coelho said. "If he senses the pressure, he'll change his patterns. Or worse, the co-facilitator," Salgado said. "She doesn't know anything yet." Coelho looked at the box around her name on his legal pad. "But she's getting close to something, I can feel it. How close? Close enough that I need to get to her before he does." Marcus felt it on Thursday. He could not have identified the specific source. That was the nature of it. It was not a single observable thing. It was an aggregate, a shift in the atmospheric pressure of his ordinary week, so slight that most people would not have registered it at all. Marcus registered it the way a man registers the first change in air before weather arrives. Not seeing the storm, not hearing it, simply knowing. Gerald had been quiet in session Tuesday, not his usual thoughtful quiet, a different quality. The quiet of a man who was managing what he knew rather than processing what he felt. A distinction invisible to most clinicians. Visible to Marcus. Carl had looked at him twice during the session, with an expression he had not seen from her before, not grief. Something that sat adjacent to grief and had a harder edge. He had fielded it with warmth and patience and filed it. And Donnie had been present and engaged, and professionally appropriate in every observable way. Her questions were good. Her facilitation instincts were sound. She had said nothing unusual and done nothing unusual. But she had not stayed to stack the chairs. For the first time in 6 weeks, she had said good night at the door with the other group members and walked out into the Newberry Street evening without lingering. He had watched her go with the focused attention he brought to anomalies, and he had noted the absence of the usual pause, the usual half-invented reason to remain, and he had filed it beside Gerald's quality of quiet and Carol's new expression, and the aggregate had produced, in the cool analytical space where his instincts operated, a single word: pressure. Something was applying pressure to the edges of his world. He did not know what, he did not know how much. He did not know whether it was the early tremor of a problem that could be managed, or the first signal of a collapse that was already in motion. He sat at his desk in Suite 204 after the last client of the day had left, and he opened his journal and he looked at it for a long time. The names, the circles, the operational notes written in the careful handwriting of a man who had always believed that the risk of documentation was smaller than the risk of forgetting. He looked at Donnie's name. He looked at Patrick's name with the date 4 weeks out written beneath it. He looked at the journal as a whole, the accumulated architecture of 15 years, and he thought about the shape of what was happening around him with the cold, dispassionate clarity that had always been his most reliable instrument. Then he closed the journal. He placed it in the center drawer of his desk, which he locked. He sat for another moment. Then he opened the drawer again, took the journal out, and placed it inside his coat, against his chest, where it would stay until he understood the shape of the pressure and decided what to do about it. He turned off the floor lamps. In the dark, for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Hale sat in a room and felt something that was not quite what he would have called fear, because fear required a belief in consequences, and Marcus had never fully believed in consequences for himself, but was adjacent to fear in the way that all his feelings were adjacent to their names rather than occupying them fully. He sat with it. He was very good at sitting with things. Outside on Newberry Street, the rain came down. Act 3, Session 2, First Contact. Coelho called Donnie Rise on a Friday morning at 9:14, which was 17 minutes after she had arrived at her desk at Boston Family Services and was still on her first cup of coffee and had not yet decided what to do with the document she had been building. Since 11 the previous night, she almost let it go to voicemail. Unknown number, Boston Exchange, the kind of call that was either important or a warranty extension on a car she did not own. Something made her answer. She would think about that later. The instinct that picked up the phone before the second ring had finished. Ms. Rise, the voice said. My name is Raymond Coelho. I'm a detective with Boston Police Department District B2. I'd like to talk with you about your work with Mending Boston at your convenience, but as soon as possible. Donnie set down her coffee cup very carefully. How soon? She said. Today would be good. Coelho said, if that works. She looked at her calendar, 2 afternoon case reviews and a 3 o'clock supervision that her supervisor would reschedule without complaint if Donnie told her it was necessary. She had never in 4 years asked her supervisor to reschedule anything. She was aware of that fact in this moment with the particular clarity of a person realizing how much of their life had been organized around not asking for things. 1 o'clock, she said. There's a coffee place on Washington Street, 2 blocks from my office. I know it, Coelho said. 1 o'clock? He paused before hanging up. The pause of a man deciding whether to say one more thing. Miss Rise, between now and 1 o'clock, if you have any contact with Dr. Hale for any reason, I'd ask you to keep it brief and entirely routine. Can you do that? The coffee place on Washington Street suddenly felt very far away. Yes, she said. She hung up and sat at her desk and looked at the document she had been building since 11 the previous night and understood, with a cold and settling certainty, that she had not been overthinking. She had been underthinking. She spent the morning working with the focused mechanical efficiency of someone who needed to keep their hands occupied while their mind processed something too large to process directly. She filed 3 case reports. She returned 2 phone calls. She attended a 10 o'clock team meeting and said the right things at the right moments and accepted a colleague's offer of a second coffee and sat with it, going cold at her elbow without noticing. At 12:45, she put on her coat and walked out into the gray April morning and stood on the Washington Street sidewalk for a moment with the cold air on her face and thought about 6 weeks of Tuesday evenings and a man whose compassion had no heat and a sister who did not appear in any record that should have held it. She walked to the coffee place. Coelho was already there. She recognized him from nothing except the way he was sitting, which was with his back to a wall facing the door, a habit so deeply ingrained in people who had spent decades in rooms where something could go wrong that it survived retirement and off-duty hours and casual coffee meetings without effort. He was a compact man in his early 50s with the particular face of someone who had listened to terrible things for a long time and had not looked away. He stood when she came in and shook her hand, and his grip was firm and brief and entirely professional. They sat. He ordered nothing. She wrapped her hands around a coffee she did not drink. I'm going to tell you some things, he said. And then I'm going to ask you some things, and I want you to know before I do. Either that nothing you tell me will be wrong, you're not a suspect, you're not a person of interest, you are someone who has been in proximity to a situation without knowing the full shape of it, and I am trying to help you understand that shape before it gets closer to you. Donnie looked at him steadily. Tell me, he told. He was precise and economical, and he watched her face as he spoke with the practiced attention of a man reading a room, gauging what she could absorb and at what pace. He gave her the names: Paulson, Callahan, Marsh, Beaumont, Rourke, 5 confirmed, 9 years of confirmed. possibly more beyond that, in the further history he had not yet fully excavated. He gave her the shape of the pattern, the isolated grieving women and men connected at peripheral distances to mending Boston. The man named Daniel that Ruth Callahan had mentioned to her neighbor before she disappeared. The brown coat, the gray temples, the description that fit Marcus Hale in every particular. He did not tell her about the journal. He did not know about the journal yet. She told him about the journal, not all of it. She did not know all of it. She told him about the black hardcover notebook that Marcus kept on his desk alongside his session notes and guarded with an attention she had registered as mildly unusual without acting on it. The way he always closed it when she entered the office. The way he had touched it once, briefly, with the flat of his hand. The way you touched something you needed to confirm was still there, Doc Coelho wrote in his notebook without looking down. Have you ever seen inside it? Nope. Has he ever left it unattended in a place where you could have accessed it? She thought about the time she had been in Suite 204 alone, arriving early, staying after, the natural rhythms of a shared workspace that created gaps. Once, she said, 3 weeks ago, he stepped out to walk a client to the elevator. He was gone maybe 4 minutes and the journal was on the desk. Yikes, closed, yikes. Coelho looked at her. What did you do? Nothing, she said. I thought about it and decided I was being paranoid and I didn't pause. I've been rethinking that decision for 3 weeks. Coelho nodded once without judgment. When you think about his behavior in the past 2 weeks specifically, has anything changed? Any deviation from his established patterns? Anything that felt different, even if you couldn't name why? Donnie thought about Tuesday, about not staying to stack the chairs because something in her had needed the open air of Newbury Street without another minute of his orbit. About the way he had watched her say goodnight with an expression she had not seen from him before, neutral and alert in a way that was different from his usual warmth. Tuesday, she said, he watched me leave differently. Coelho wrote in the journal, she said, Wednesday morning I came in early to drop off paperwork. It wasn't on his desk. It's always on his desk. Coelho stopped writing. He looked at her with the focused stillness of a man who had just heard something significant and was deciding how to hold it. It wasn't there Wednesday. No, he wrote something and underlined it. She could not see what M's rise, Danny. He set his pen down and looked at her directly in the way of a man, saying something that needed to be received without distraction. I need you to continue attending Tuesday sessions as normal. I need nothing about your behavior or your relationship with Dr. Hale to change in any observable way. Can you do that? She thought about sitting 3 feet away from him next Tuesday, about handing him tea, about the warmth of his attention and the way it landed on her and the way she now understood that warmth, the way she understood a gas burner left on in an empty room.
Yes,
she said, because it was true and because the alternative was unacceptable to her and because she was, when the self-doubt cleared enough for her actual character to be visible, not the kind of person who left a room when the room needed her in it. Doc Coelho looked at her for a moment longer. Good, he said quietly. He picked up his pen. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Every detail you remember, regardless of whether it seems relevant. We have time. They were there for 2 hours. Outside on Washington Street. Boston moved through its ordinary Friday afternoon, indifferent and continuous. The city's great democratic noise absorbing everything without distinction. Frank and Coelho met that evening at a bar in West Roxbury that Frank had been going to for 20 years, and where the bartender knew his order and did not initiate conversation, which were his 2 primary criteria for a bar. They took a booth in the back. Coelho arrived 8 minutes after Frank and slid in across from him and looked at the legal pad Frank had placed on the table between them. You kept notes, Coelho said. I keep notes on everything, Frank said. I've kept notes on everything since 1984. Coelho looked at the legal pad, 2 columns and a 3rd column with Marcus Hale at the top and 4 bullet points beneath it and a double underlined instruction at the bottom. He read it without touching it and then looked up. You're good. I was good, Frank said. I'm a retired man with bad knees who has been walking surveillance on a public sidewalk in the rain for 2 weeks because something felt wrong and I could not leave it alone. Same instinct, Coelho said. Same instinct, Frank agreed. He picked up his beer. How many? 5 confirmed over 9 years. Possibly more. I have someone working the further history, but it takes time and the records before a certain point require physical archive access. Frank was quiet with that for a moment. The bar around them was the Friday evening quiet of a neighborhood place, low and unhurried, a few regulars at the bar, a couple in a booth near the window. Ordinary Boston. Ordinary Friday. 40 blocks away in an apartment on Commonwealth Avenue, a man in a brown cardigan was sitting by a window with a journal against his chest. The girl, Frank said. Danny, I talked to her today. She's solid. She's going back Tuesday. Frank looked at him. I know, Coelho said. I'm not comfortable with it either. but pulling her out signals him, and if he's already sensing pressure, he moves the timeline, Frank said. On Patrick Dolan or on someone we don't know about yet. Coelho turned his coffee cup in his hands. I need 1 more week. 2 at the outside. I need the warrant application to have enough to survive a challenge, and right now what I have is a pattern and a description and a journal. Nobody has seen inside. The journal, Frank said. If it is what I think it is, it's everything. Names, dates, operational notes, a 15-year documented history that no defense attorney in the world can explain away. He paused. But I need to get to it without him, knowing I'm coming, and without it disappearing first. Frank thought about the brown coat and the blank expression, and the 22 years he had spent in rooms with men who had done things that required a certain kind of interior absence. He already moved it once, he said. He's not going to stop moving it, no, Coelho said. He's not. They sat with the problem for a moment, 2 men who had spent their working lives solving problems that had no clean solutions, who understood that the distance between enough evidence and justice was sometimes the most dangerous distance of all. Tuesday session, Frank said. I'll be in the room. You'll be in the room anyway. You're a group member. I mean, I'll be paying attention in a specific way. Frank set down his beer. If his behavior has changed, if he's escalating or contracting, I'll see it. And if anything moves in a direction that puts Donnie at immediate risk, I will not be waiting for a warrant. Coelho looked at him for a long moment. He thought about protocol and procedure and the careful architecture of a case that needed to survive prosecution. He thought about Donnie Reyes, walking into Suite 204 on Tuesday evening and sitting 3 feet away from a man who had moved his journal because the pressure was changing. I didn't hear that, Coelho said. Frank picked up his beer. Hear what? He said. Marcus spent Friday evening and all of Saturday in a state of controlled reassessment that he would not have called fear but that operated in the same register. He was methodical about it. He sat at the window in his apartment on Commonwealth Avenue with a glass of scotch and the journal in his lap, and he examined each variable the way a surgeon examined a field before making the first incision. Clean and without sentiment and with total honesty about what he was seeing. Gerald, the quality of his quiet had changed, not dramatically subtly, the quiet of a man managing information rather than processing emotion. Gerald had been a detective, Coelho had been a detective. The possibility of a connection between them was not something Marcus had previously considered because Gerald had always been present in the room as a grieving man first and a former professional second, and Marcus had allowed that framing to override the obvious implication of the man's history. That was a mistake. He did not make mistakes often enough to be practiced at acknowledging them, but he was honest enough to name this one. Carl's expression on Tuesday. The harder edge beneath the grief, she had filed the missing persons report on Trevor, and the investigation had apparently produced nothing but the act of filing it, of having the machinery of official concern set in motion, had changed something in her relationship to the room to him. She was no longer entirely inside her grief. Part of her was watching. And Donnie, who had not stayed to stack the chairs. Donnie, who had said goodnight with the careful brightness of a person performing normalcy rather than experiencing it. Donnie, who had come in early Wednesday morning and whose eyes had moved, briefly and quickly, to the center of his desk where the journal usually sat. She had noticed its absence. He thought about that for a long time, then he picked up his phone and sent her a text. Brief and warm and entirely routine, the kind of collegial message a supervisor might send a co-facilitator on a Friday evening. He was thinking about adjusting the group format slightly for the following Tuesday session and wanted her input. Nothing urgent. Just whenever she had a moment over the weekend. He set the phone down. He waited. Her reply came 11 minutes later. Cheerful, engaged. 3 sentences about the format question that were thoughtful and professionally appropriate and gave away nothing. He read it twice. He set the phone down. He picked up the journal and held it in both hands and thought about the 15 years of names and circles and careful operational notes pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. And he thought about the shape of the pressure and the question of whether it was manageable or whether it was something else entirely. He was very good at reading rooms. The room was changing. He needed to decide before Tuesday whether to contract or to move, whether the play was stillness and patience and the continued performance of normalcy, or whether the play was something faster and more final. He thought about Donnie's reply, cheerful, engaged, giving away nothing. He thought about how good she was at that for a woman whose instincts had been quietly sounding an alarm for 6 weeks. He thought that she was either exactly what she appeared to be, a perceptive co-facilitator who was managing her unease through professional engagement. Or she was something else. He poured a second scotch. He did not sleep well that night, which was unprecedented, and which he noted in the same clinical, detached way he noted everything. As information rather than experience. And the morning he put on the brown coat. He walked Commonwealth Avenue in the early gray light, with the journal inside the coat and the city waking up around him, indifferent and continuous. And he thought about patience and about pressure and about the specific calculus of a man who had always known that the longest run eventually reached its end, and had always believed, with the deep, irrational certainty of someone who had never been caught, that his would not. He was still mostly certain, but mostly was a word he had not previously needed. He walked until the certainty steadied. Then he went home and made coffee and reviewed his Tuesday schedule and moved through the rest of the weekend with the clean, quiet efficiency of a man who had made his decision and was waiting for the moment to act on it. The rain started again Sunday afternoon. He found it less comforting than usual. Act 3, Session 3, the room that knew Tuesday arrived the way Tuesdays always arrived on Newbury Street, indifferent, unhurried. The block smelling of coffee from the place on the corner, and bergamot from the yoga studio 2 doors down, and the particular wet stone smell of Boston brick after rain. Donnie arrived 14 minutes early. She stood outside Suite 204 with the frosted glass door and the small printed placard, and took a breath the way she had taken a breath the very first time 6 weeks ago, when she had been nervous for reasons she could not name and had told herself she was overthinking. She was not overthinking now. She knew exactly what was on the other side of the door, and she was going to open it anyway because Coelho had asked her to, and because Frank would be in the room, and because 3 feet away from a man who had done what Marcus Hale had done was still closer to stopping him than standing on the sidewalk outside. She pushed open the door. Marcus was adjusting a chair. He looked up and smiled, and the smile reached his eyes completely, and she received it the way she had learned to receive things that were technically accurate and emotionally empty. The way you received a perfect forgery, with the surface appreciation appropriate to the craft and the cold knowledge of what it actually was underneath. Donnie, he said. I'm glad you're here. Wouldn't miss it, she said. Her voice was even. She was quietly astonished by how even it was. She hung up her coat. She helped arrange the tea things on the table by the window. She asked about the format adjustment he had texted her about on Friday, and he explained it briefly, and she nodded and made a note on her pad, and they moved through the preparatory minutes of the session, with the easy collegial rhythm they had developed over 6 weeks, and she did not look at the center of his desk, and she did not look at his coat hanging on the hook, pressed against his chest, because if she thought about it, she would not be able to look at him as the chest, because if she charvni yonen, with the expression she needed to sustain for the next 90 minutes. She thought about Ruth instead, about Ruth telling her sister it was nothing, about the window boxes of dying plants on Perkins Street, about a woman who had felt the first thin warmth of an unexpected sun, and had gone toward it the way anyone would have gone toward it after 14 months of cold that kept her eyes steady, that kept her voice. Even the group arrived. Frank came in third, behind Priya and ahead of Gerald, and took his usual chair with the careful deliberateness of his bad knees, and the particular quality of stillness that Donnie now understood was not just temperament but trained professional discipline. He accepted the tea Marcus offered and said thank you in the flat, complete way he said most things, and sat with his large hands loose in his lap and his eyes moving through the room with the unhurried thoroughness of a man reading a text he had read before, and was reading again for the things he had missed the first time. He met Donnie's eyes once, briefly. Nothing passed between them that anyone watching could have named. Everything passed between them that needed to Greld arrived last. He moved to his chair and sat with the careful deliberateness of a man carrying more than his usual weight, and Marcus greeted him with the specific warmth he reserved for Gerald, the hand on the shoulder, the unhurried eye contact, and Donnie watched Gerald receive it with the surface acceptance of a man who had spent 22 years watching people perform things they did not feel and knew exactly what performance looked like from the inside. Gerald was extraordinary. She would think about that afterward. The absolute precision of his performance in that room on that Tuesday, sitting across from the man he had helped build a case against, receiving the warmth and the hand on the shoulder and the focused patient attention without a single observable flinch. Carol settled into her chair last, slightly breathless as always. She looked worse than last week, the particular deterioration of someone whose hope was running out faster than their grief was resolving. Donnie felt the pull of that, the clinical instinct to respond to it, and let it ground her in the room rather than in the things she knew about the room. Marcus opened the session. Let's start where we always start, he said. Who's carrying something in tonight that they didn't have last week? His voice was exactly what it always was. Low, unhurried, warm without being performative, the voice of a man who cared completely and was present entirely and had nowhere else to be. Donnie listened to it with both of her ears and thought about 5 names on a detective's legal pad and kept her face open and attentive and gave away nothing. Gerald spoke first, which was unusual. He said he was thinking about Ruth, that the welfare check had produced nothing, and the missing persons report was active, and that he found himself in the position of not knowing whether to grieve or to wait, which he recognized from his professional history as one of the most difficult positions a person could occupy. Marcus listened with his full and total attention. He said that the uncertainty of an unresolved situation was its own kind of grief, that the mind needed a narrative to process loss, and that absence without explanation denied the mind the raw material it needed to begin. He said it with the warm, unhurried authority of a man who had spent 15 years helping people navigate exactly this kind of pain. Donnie thought about Ruth in the basement on Medford Street and kept her face soft and present, and did not look at Frank and did not look at Marcus's coat on the hook by the door, and did not reach for the phone in her pocket that had Coelho's number in it, and breathed through it the way she had breathed through every hard thing in her adult life, which was one breath at a time without looking too far ahead. Carol spoke. She had heard from the detective working Trevor's case, a routine update call, brief and careful, containing nothing actionable. She described it with the flat, exhausted voice of a woman who had been hoping for something and had received procedure instead. Frank said something small and genuine about waiting. Priya put her hand briefly on Carol's arm. Gerald looked at the rug. Marcus guided the session the way a conductor guided an orchestra. The pacing was perfect. The transitions were smooth. Every silence was held for exactly the right duration, and every thread was followed to exactly the right depth and then released. It was by every observable clinical standard masterful group facilitation. It was also a performance by a man who had felt the pressure changing all week and had made a decision about it, and was spending this Tuesday evening determining whether the decision needed to be accelerated. Donnie could feel him thinking. That was the thing she had not expected. Underneath the warmth, underneath the perfect clinical surface, she could feel the cold analytical engine running. Not because she could see anything specific, because she knew now what she was looking for, and knowing changed everything you saw. She wondered if Frank could feel it too. She thought he probably could. She thought Frank had probably been feeling it for longer than either of them had been willing to say out loud. The session ended at 8:47. The group gathered themselves with the slow reluctance of people who had found something bearable in the room and were not quite ready to return to the world outside it. Carol lingered at the tea table. Gerald helped Priya with her coat, with the courtly instinct of a man from a generation that did those things automatically. Marcus stood at the door and said goodnight to each of them, with the specific personal warmth he reserved for endings. A hand briefly pressed. A name said, a small particular acknowledgement of whatever each person had brought into the room that evening. He was extraordinary at endings. Donnie had thought that since the first session he made each person feel, in the space of the goodbye, that they were the most important person who had been in that room. Frank was the last to leave. He shook Marcus's hand at the door with the firm, brief grip of a man saying goodnight to a neighbor, and walked out into the hallway and did not look back. And Donnie heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then the street door below, and then nothing. She stayed. She had not planned to. The plan she and Coelho had agreed on was normal behavior, which for the past 6 weeks had included staying to stack the chairs, and last Tuesday she had not stayed, which had been the anomaly, and which she needed to correct tonight. She had known she was staying. She had simply not prepared herself adequately for what staying would feel like once the room was empty, except for the two of them. Marcus was at the window. The brown coat was still on the hook. He had not put it on yet. She stacked 2 chairs and set them against the wall and stacked 2 more. Good session, she said. Her voice was even. She continued to be quietly astonished by this. Gerald is struggling, Marcus said. He was looking out the window at the Newbury Street evening. The amber light from the floor lamps behind him throwing his shadow long across the floor. The ambiguity is harder for him than confirmed loss would be. It's a particular kind of torture not knowing. Yes, Donnie said. She stacked the last chairs. She moved to the tea table and gathered the cups normal routine, the texture of every Tuesday evening for 6 weeks. Can I ask you something, Marcus said. He had not turned from the window. Her hands stilled on the cups. One beat, she made them move again. Of course, she said. He turned. His expression was what it always was. Warm, open, entirely readable, the face of a man who had nothing to hide and never had. Are you all right? He said. You seem like you're carrying something the past couple of weeks. He tilted his head slightly. You don't have to share it. I just want you to know I notice, and that I'm here if it would help to talk. She looked at him at the warmth that was structurally perfect and had no heat at the face. She had sat across from for 6 weeks, at the man behind the face who had written 5 names, and probably more in a journal he now carried inside his coat, and who had built a room full of grieving people. and tended them with extraordinary care, so that their peripheral connections would flow through the room like a current he could direct. She thought about what Coelho had said in the coffee place on Washington Street. Nothing about your behavior changes. Nothing observable shifts. She set down the cups. She let her face do the thing it had been doing all evening. The thing she had not known she was capable of until tonight, which was being entirely present and entirely honest and entirely concealed all at the same time. "I'm okay," she said. "Just tired. It's been a long few weeks." He nodded slowly. "Get some rest," he said. "You're doing important work here. I don't want you to burn out before you've really found your stride." "I won't," she said. She picked up her coat. She said goodnight. She walked to the door. "Danny," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with something she had not seen from him before. Not the warm clinical attention. Not the managed compassion. Something underneath those things. Something that was assessing rather than caring. Measuring rather than receiving. The cold analytical engine visible for one unguarded second through the surface of the performance. Light lasted less than 2 seconds. Then it was gone and the warmth was back and he smiled and said, "Same time next week. Same time next week," she said. She walked out. She took the stairs at a normal pace and pushed through the street door and stood on the Newberry Street sidewalk in the cold air and breathed once hard, and then took out her phone and texted Coelho 3 words. He made eye contact. She walked south toward Boylston Street and did not look back at the amber light falling from the second-floor windows of Suite 204 and did not see Marcus standing at the glass watching her until she was gone. Coelho read the text at 8:53. He was in his car on Dartmouth Street, 2 blocks north, where he had been since 7:30. He read it twice and then looked at the building and then looked at his phone and typed back 1 word, understood. He sat for another 20 minutes after the lights in Suite 204 went dark and watched Marcus emerge from the building in the brown coat and walk south on Newberry and disappear around the corner toward the Back Bay T station. He noted the time. He noted the direction. He noted that the coat hung slightly differently than it had in the photographs from the practice website. A barely perceptible weight inside the left breast, the kind of difference you saw when a man was carrying something close to his body, the journal. He was still carrying it. Coelho thought about the warrant application sitting on his desk at B2, 23 pages of documented pattern and circumstantial connection, and testimony from a retired detective and a co-facilitator and a nursery owner in Roslindale, and thought about how close it was to sufficient, and how the distance between close and sufficient was the distance between a man walking free on a Tuesday evening and everything that came after. He needed one more thing. He had known since Friday what the one more thing was. He had been building toward it since the box from Salgado had landed on his desk. He needed someone inside that office with enough time and enough access and enough nerve to open the center drawer of Marcus Hale's desk and confirm what was in it. He looked at the darkened windows of Suite 204. He looked at his phone. He thought about Donnie Rise walking into that room every Tuesday and sitting 3 feet away from something that most people never sat 3 feet away from, and understanding exactly what it was and not flinching. He thought about how much he was going to ask of her. He started the car. He drove back to B2 with the warrant application on his passenger seat, and the particular cold weight of a case that was close enough to see the finish and far enough to lose everything if he moved wrong. The rain started again on the drive back. Of course it did. This was Boston in April, and the rain was always there, patient and indifferent, washing the streets clean of the daily accumulation of everything that happened on them. 3 miles away in an apartment in Somerville that smelled of takeout containers and unread mail, Patrick Dolan was watching television with the unfocused attention of a man who was present in the room and nowhere else simultaneously. His phone was on the cushion beside him. He had not called anyone today. He had not been called. This was normal now. This was the shape his days had taken since February, and he had begun to mistake the shape for permanent, the way people did when a temporary condition lasted long enough to stop feeling temporary. His phone lit up unbrunt number, Boston Exchange. He picked it up because he always picked up unknown numbers in case it was something important, the habit of a man who had learned that not picking up could mean missing the call that mattered. "Patrick," said a voice, quiet, unhurried, warm, without being performative. "My name is Daniel. I think we have a mutual friend at Boston Family Services. I hope I'm not calling too late." Patrick sat up slightly. He did not know anyone named Daniel, but the voice was the kind of voice that made you feel, in the first 10 seconds of hearing it, that whoever was speaking had called specifically because they cared about you and had nowhere else to be. "No," Patrick said. "It's not too late." "Good," said Marcus. "I'm glad I caught you." Outside Patrick's window, the rain came down in straight cold lines across the Somerville evening, and a man in a brown coat moved through it somewhere in the city, unhurried and patient, a phone pressed to his ear, the journal against his chest, the clean interior quiet of a decision already made settling around him like weather. The timeline had moved. Patrick Dolan had 10 days. Act 3, Session 4, the center drawer Coelho called Donnie at 7:45 Wednesday morning before she had left her apartment. She was standing at her kitchen window with coffee, watching the rain come down on the street below the way it had been coming down every morning for 2 weeks. Patient and gray and indifferent, she picked up on the first ring. "I need to ask you something," Coelho said, "and I need you to know before I ask it that the answer can be no. The answer can be no without consequence or explanation, and I will find another way." She set down her coffee. "Ask," she said. He asked. She stood at the kitchen window for a long moment after he finished, looking at the rain on the street below, thinking about Suite 204 and the center drawer of Marcus's desk and the black hardcover journal that might be everything, and might be the difference between a case that held and a case that didn't, and a man who kept walking free on Tuesday evenings in a brown coat with the weight of 15 years pressed against his chest. "When," she said Thursday, Coelho said, "he has a gap between clients from 2 to 2:45. I've been running his schedule through the practice's online booking system, and that gap has been consistent for 6 weeks. Enough time for you to go in with a reason, access the desk, photograph what's inside, and be gone before he returns. What if the drawer is locked? I'll have someone outside the building. If you signal there's a problem, you're out in 30 seconds. What if the journal isn't there? Then it isn't there, and we find another way, and you walk out and nothing has changed." A pause. "Donnie, I would not ask this if I had another option that didn't risk tipping him before the warrant is complete." She thought about Patrick Dolan, whose name she did not yet know. She thought about the next person whose name she also did not know. She thought about the room on Newberry Street full of grieving people who trusted completely, and the peripheral connections that flowed through it like a current. "I'll do it," she said. She heard Coelho exhale. Not relief exactly, the sound of a man who had been carrying a question and had received an answer and could now move to the next thing. "Thursday, 2 o'clock, he said. "I'll be on Dartmouth Street." Same spot, she said. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Frank found out about Patrick on Wednesday afternoon through the specific combination of institutional memory and personal connection that had always been his most reliable investigative instrument. He had called Petrosian at B2 on Tuesday evening, after the session, after the careful drive home through the rain, and had asked in the oblique way of a man who knew how to ask things obliquely whether Coelho had made any progress on the pattern he was working. Petrosian, who knew everything that moved through B2, and most of what moved through the adjacent districts, had said that Coelho was close on the warrant, but was missing something from inside the office and was working on how to get it. Frank had said he understood and thanked him and hung up and sat at his kitchen table with his legal pad and thought about the inside of the office and about the missing piece and about Donnie Rise, who was the only person with regular legitimate access to Suite 204 and who was, he already knew, going to say yes to whatever Coelho asked because she was that kind of person and the world both needed that kind of person and consistently put them in the most dangerous positions available. He had not slept well. Wednesday morning he had walked his usual surveillance loop around the Newberry Street block, not because he expected to see anything actionable, but because movement helped him think, and the loop had become a kind of ritual processing, the physical rhythm of it organizing what he knew into what mattered. He was on his second loop when he saw the woman from the nursery. He recognized her from Coelho's description. Mai, small, Vietnamese, the economy of movement and expression of someone who said what was necessary and nothing else. She was on Newberry Street because she had a plant supplier 2 blocks over, he would learn later, a Wednesday morning routine that had nothing to do with anything. She was simply there, and she was looking at a man across the street. Frank followed her gaze. The man was standing outside a coffee shop on the opposite side of Newberry, waiting for an order through the window pickup, phone to his ear, back partly turned. Slim, gray at the temples, brown coat. Frank looked at Mai. Mai was looking at the man with the fixed, unblinking attention of a woman who had spent 3 days since Coelho's visit turning a face over in her memory, and had just found it outside a coffee shop on a Wednesday morning. Frank crossed the street. He reached her before she could do anything, and he said very quietly, without stopping walking, "Don't look at him, walk with me." Now she walked. They turned the corner onto Dartmouth Street, and Frank took out his phone and called Coelho and said, "Mai from the nursery just made visual confirmation on Newberry Street. Daniel is Hale, she is certain." Coelho said 2 words that Frank had not heard from a working detective in 4 years, but that he recognized immediately as the sound of a man whose case had just found its footing. Then Coelho said, "Where is he now?" Coffee shop on Newbury, west side. He didn't see her. Are you sure? Frank thought about the brown coat and the back partly turned, and Maya's fixed attention lasting no more than 4 seconds before he had intercepted her. 85%, he said honestly. Good enough, Coelho said. Get her somewhere and take a full statement. I need it in writing by end of day. Frank looked at Mai, who was standing beside him on Dartmouth Street with the absolute composure of a woman who had processed the situation and arrived at the part where she did whatever was needed. She's ready, he said. He took her to the coffee place on Washington Street where Coelho had met Donnie, because it was the nearest place he knew, and because there was a kind of grim appropriateness to it that he did not mention to anyone. He bought her tea she did not drink and took her statement in the careful sequential way he had taken 1,000 statements, and when it was done he had 4 pages of precise consistent testimony from a woman who had looked at a face for 3 days in her memory and had seen it on a street and had been certain visual confirmation. Eyewitness. The man named Daniel who had groomed Ruth Callahan through 6 weeks of Saturday visits to a plant nursery in Roslindale was Marcus Ellen Hale of Suite 204 on Newbury Street. The warrant application was now 24 pages long. Marty was still missing the inside of the center drawer. Coelho spread everything across his desk at B2 on Wednesday afternoon and looked at it the way he had been looking at it for 2 weeks, which was the way you looked at something that was almost there and not yet there, and that the almost was costing you in ways you could feel but not fully quantify. He had the pattern. 9 years. 5 confirmed names. The Beaumont and Rourke cold cases reframed as the earliest confirmed instances of a methodology that had been running without interruption. Since at least 2015, he had the nursery connection tying the name Daniel to the face of Marcus Hale through Mai's eyewitness account. He had Frank's surveillance documentation, carefully written and legally useless but useful for building the internal narrative of the case. He had Donnie's account of the journal, its location, its guarded nature, Marcus's physical custody of it after the atmospheric pressure had changed. What he did not have was the contents. A warrant application without the contents was a circumstantial case, strong circumstantially, strong enough to get Marcus Hale into an interview room, possibly, strong enough to compel a search of the office, probably, if the judge was having the right kind of day and the application was argued well, but a search of the office would find the journal only if the journal was in the office, and the journal had not been in the office since the Thursday, when Donnie had come in early and found the center of the desk empty. He thought about the journal against the chest, the weight visible in the coat. Even if he executed a search warrant on the office today, he might find nothing. And a search warrant executed and returned empty-handed told Marcus Hale exactly where the investigation stood and gave him time to disappear in ways that a man who had been this careful for this long would be very good at. He needed the journal. He needed what was in it. He needed Donnie to open the center drawer on Thursday and photograph whatever she found, and he needed to not think too carefully about the specific risk he was asking her to carry into that room. He was thinking about it anyway. He thought about it the way he thought about all the things in this job that required you to ask someone else to carry a weight you could not carry for them, which was with the full acknowledgement of what you were asking and without the comfort of pretending it was smaller than it was. Salgado called at 4. I have something, she said. Physical Archive, Helen Rourke 9 years ago. The original case file has an intake form from Mending Boston with a full signature. I have a handwriting exemplar from Hale's practice paperwork from his Mass General days. Coelho sat up. How close, he said. I have a document examiner who will testify they are the same hand, Salgado said. It puts him in the room with Rourke before she disappeared. Not on the night, but in the room. That's enough, Coelho said. That combined with Mai's identification and the pattern evidence. Almost enough, Salgado said, with the precision of a woman who did not say almost when she meant enough. The Dawes office will want more for a case this size. For 15 years and 5 names, they will want something that cannot be characterized as circumstantial by a defense attorney with a full billing rate and a motivated client. Coelho looked at the warrant application on his desk. I know, he said. I'm working on it. He hung up and looked at the application and thought about Thursday and about a center drawer, and about a young woman who had said the answer can be no and then said yes anyway. Thursday arrived gray and cold, with the rain that had become the permanent atmospheric condition of this investigation, as though the city itself understood the shape of what was happening and had decided that the appropriate weather for it was the kind that emptied streets and muffled sound and made everyone move faster with their heads down and their attention on the ground in front of them, rather than on the people moving through the same space. Donnie got to Newbury Street at 1:45. She did not go directly to the building. She went to the coffee place on the corner and ordered something she would not drink and sat at the window and watched the street and thought about the 6 weeks of Tuesday evenings and the specific texture of a room she now understood differently than she had understood it when she had first pushed through the frosted glass door with 12 minutes to spare and a feeling she could not name. She had named it now. She finished not drinking her coffee and walked to the building at 158. The lobby was empty. The building's other tenants kept conventional hours, and the afternoon gap between the yoga studio's noon class and its evening schedule left the second-floor hallway quiet, in a way that felt specific to her purpose, as though the building had conspired with the timing. She had a key. She had always had a key. Co-facilitators were given keys in the second week as a matter of operational practicality. Marcus had handed it to her with the warm, unhurried manner he brought to everything, and she had put it on her keyring and used it 8 times since then, and had never thought about it as anything other than what it was, which was access, which was now something else entirely. She unlocked Suite 204. The office was exactly what it always was. Amber light from the floor lamps she had switched on, the circle of chairs, the tea table, the smell of bergamot from the yoga studio drifting through the ventilation in the particular way it always did. Everything in its place with the managed precision of a room that was also a performance. She went to the desk. She stood in front of it for 1 second, maybe 2, with her hand on the center drawer and the sound of her own breathing very loud in the quiet of the room. She thought about Ruth. She opened the drawer. The journal was there. She stared at it for a moment that was both very long and very short, the way moments were when they contained something you had been moving toward for weeks and had not fully believed you would find. Black hardback cover. Standard size. The cover slightly worn at the corners from handling, from being carried inside a coat against a chest, from 15 years of careful documentation pressed between 2 hands. She took out her phone. She opened the journal. The handwriting was Marcus's, which she recognized from the session notes he occasionally left on the table for her review. Small and precise and entirely legible, the handwriting of a man who valued clarity above everything, and who had applied that value to the documentation of things that should not have been documented at all. The first page was dated 9 years ago. She did not read it. She photographed it. She turned pages and photographed them. She worked with the focused mechanical efficiency of someone who had decided what they were doing and was doing it without allowing the content of what she was seeing to land on her fully, because if she let it land on her fully, she would stop, and she could not stop. She saw name. She saw dates. She saw small circles beside some names and lines through others and operational notes written in the same careful hand as everything else. She saw Ruth's name. She saw a circle and then a line and then a date and a single word after it that she photographed and did not read. She turned pages. She photographed 31 pages in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Which she knew because she had started her phone stopwatch when she opened the drawer, and which Coelho had told her was the maximum safe window before she needed to be gone. She closed the journal. She placed it back in the center drawer in the exact position she had found it, which she had memorized in the first second of opening the drawer the way you memorize things when the memorizing mattered. She closed the drawer. She walked to the door. She turned off the floor lamps. She pulled the door shut behind her and locked it with her key, and stood in the second-floor hallway for one breath and then walked to the stairs and down and through the lobby and out onto the Newberry Street sidewalk into the cold gray afternoon. She texted Coelho 2 words. I have it. She walked south toward Dartmouth Street, and she did not run, and she did not look back, and she breathed the cold, wet Boston air and even measured breaths and felt the specific quality of a thing done that could not be undone, and was glad Doc Coelho's car was at the curb on Dartmouth Street. She got in. He looked at her phone for 11 minutes without speaking. She sat in the passenger seat and looked at the rain on the windshield and listened to the sound of him turning pages in the photographs and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a high level of controlled attention for a long time and had just been given permission to set it down. Danny, he said. She looked at him. His face had the expression of a man who had suspected something and had been confirmed and was now on the other side of confirmation where the full weight of what he had confirmed was settling. This is everything, he said quietly. Every name. Dates, locations, notes on selection methodology. It goes back further than Rourke. There's a name from 12 years ago I don't recognize yet, and one from before that. He paused. He wrote down everything. 15 years of everything. She looked at the rain on the windshield. He thought he was invisible, she said. Yes, Coelho said. He thought nobody was looking. Yes. She thought about the phrase he had used in session, the one that had become the room's recurring anchor, the phrase she had heard 11 times in 6 weeks and had received each time as wisdom and understood now as something else entirely. Grief doesn't end, she thought. It just finds a new shape. Get the warrant, she said. Coelho was already on the phone. Marcus returned to Suite 204 at 2:41, 4 minutes after Coelho's car had turned the corner onto Boylston Street and was gone. He unlocked the door. He switched on the floor lamps. He stood for a moment in the doorway of his own office with the brown coat on and the particular interior quiet that accompanied the beginning of an afternoon client session. He went to the desk. He opened the center drawer. He looked at the journal in the position he had placed it that morning, slightly left of center, spine parallel to the front edge of the drawer, the worn corner of the cover facing up. He picked it up. He held it in both hands. He stood very still for a long time. Then he set the journal down on the desk and sat in his chair and looked at it and thought about the atmospheric pressure and the quality of Gerald's quiet and Carol's harder edge and Donnie's performance over 3 Tuesday evenings that had been. He now understood with cold clarity. A performance rather than an actuality. The journal was in the position he had left it. He had also left it with the worn corner of the cover facing down. He sat with that for the full 45 minutes before his 3:30 client arrived. He sat with the absolute stillness of a man who had been careful for 15 years and had made one small error and was calculating in real time the distance between the error and the consequence. His 3:30 client knocked. He put the journal inside his coat. He went to the door. He smiled. Act 4, Session 1. The warrant and the invitation. Coelho filed the warrant application at 4:17 Thursday afternoon. He walked it to the duty judge himself rather than routing it through the standard submission process, which was not protocol and which he did anyway, because the standard submission process added 6 to 18 hours, and 6 to 18 hours was a window he was no longer willing to work within. He sat in the hallway outside Judge Carla Mendez's chambers, on the 3rd floor of Suffolk Superior Court, and waited with the application on his knee and his phone in his hand, and the specific quality of stillness that came from having done everything he could do, and having arrived at the part that was no longer in his hand. Mendez was 63, appointee of a governor 2 administrations back, known in the Dawes office as thorough rather than fast, which was a quality Coelho respected in every circumstance except this one. Her clerk took the application in at 4:22 and told Coelho she would review it this evening and have a response by 9 the following morning. He said thank you and walked back to his car and sat in it on Pemberton Square and called Salgado. 9 tomorrow morning at the earliest, he said. Salgado said nothing for a moment, and Hale's schedule tomorrow, individual client 9 to 11, gap 11 to 1, mending Boston Tuesday evening, but tomorrow is Friday, so nothing in the evening that I know of. He looked at the courthouse steps. If the warrant comes through at 9, we execute at 11 during the gap. Office and residence simultaneously. I'll have a team ready, Salgado said. I also want a car on his building tonight. Done a pause. Ray, if he runs tonight. He won't run tonight, Coelho said. He doesn't know how much we have. He knows someone was in his office. He doesn't know it was Donnie, and he doesn't know what she found, and he doesn't know about my or the handwriting exemplar or the archive records. He knows the journal was touched. That's all he knows. That may be enough for a man like him to move. A man like him doesn't run when he can manage, Coelho said. Running is losing control. He's been controlling this for 15 years. He'll make one more move he thinks gives him the advantage before he considers running. He started the car. That's what worries me more than the running. He drove back to B2. He did not go home that night. The text from Marcus arrived on Donnie's phone at 6:48 Thursday evening. She was at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup she was not eating, staring at the middle distance in the particular way of someone whose body had decided it was done for the day, well before their mind had reached the same conclusion. Her phone lit up on the table beside the soup, and she saw the name and felt the specific cold alertness of someone whose system had been running on adrenaline for 8 hours and had just received a signal that it was not done yet. The text was warm and brief and entirely ordinary. He was thinking about the group's trajectory and wanted to talk through a few things before Tuesday if she had time. Would she be able to stop by the office tomorrow afternoon? He had a gap from 11 to 1, coffee and a conversation, nothing formal. She read it 3 times. She thought about the worn corner of the journal cover facing up instead of down, and about a man sitting in his office for 45 minutes, calculating the distance between an error and a consequence, and arriving at a conclusion that looked, in the form of this text, like a warm collegial invitation and was something else entirely. She called Coelho. He answered before the first ring finished, which told her he had been waiting for something, possibly this specific thing. She read him the text. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds, which was long for Coelho. Don't respond yet, he said. I know. He's confirming whether you're the source. If you come in tomorrow, he watches your behavior in the office and makes his assessment. If you decline without a convincing reason, he has his answer faster. I know. she said again. Donnie, his voice shifted slightly, the professional register dropping a fraction towards something more direct. I need you to hear me clearly. You do not go into that office tomorrow. The warrant application is with the judge. If it comes through at 9, we execute at 11, and this is over before his gap begins. If it doesn't come through at 9, I will find another reason to keep you out of that building. She looked at the soup going cold on the table. And if he comes to me, she said. If he doesn't wait for the office. A pause. There will be a car on your street tonight. You won't see it, but it will be there. She thought about that. About the specific quality of being protected by something invisible, which was, she understood now, exactly the position that every person Marcus had ever selected had occupied at the end. The protection they believed was present having long since been replaced by something that only looked like it from a distance. Tell me what to text back, she said. Doc Coelho told her. She typed it exactly as he said, warm, slightly apologetic. A prior commitment tomorrow afternoon that she had forgotten about when she had seen his message. Could they talk by phone instead, or wait until Tuesday? She sent it. She put the phone face down on the table. She picked up the soup and found it cold and put it back down and sat in her quiet apartment listening to the rain on the windows and the ordinary sounds of the building around her, and thought about a car on her street she would not see, and a warrant application on a judge's desk, and the 11 photographs on her phone that she had not looked at since she had handed the phone to Coelho on Dartmouth Street. She had not looked at them because she understood that looking at them fully, letting the content of those 31 pages land on her without the task structure of the photographing to organize her response, something she was not ready for yet and might not be ready for some time. She went to bed at 10. She did not sleep. Marcus read Donnie's reply at 6:59. He sat with it for a long time prior commitment. Warm apology. The offer of a phone call or Tuesday, but was the correct response for a woman who had nothing to hide and had simply forgotten a prior engagement. It was also the correct response for a woman who had been coached on exactly what to say by someone who understood what the invitation meant and had prepared her for it. He could not tell which it was. That was the problem. That was the specific and unprecedented problem of Donnie Ray, which was that she was good enough, perceptive enough, and now apparently composed enough, that the observable evidence was genuinely ambiguous. He could not read her the way he read everyone else. The usual instruments were producing noise rather than signal. He thought about this with the cold, dispassionate clarity that had always been his most reliable resource, and arrived at the honest conclusion that he did not know. He did not know whether she was the source of the journal access, or whether the journal access had been an opportunistic entry by someone he had not yet identified. He did not know whether the pressure was organized, which meant police involvement, or personal, which meant a smaller and more manageable problem. What he knew was this: the journal had been accessed. The timeline on Patrick had already been moved, and the window in which he could operate with confidence was narrowing in a way he could feel but could not yet precisely measure. He opened the journal. He read the Patrick entry, the date, the operational notes, the approach methodology he had begun 3 weeks ago through the phone call to Somerville. He thought about what was in the rest of the journal, and what it would mean if it was now in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. He closed the journal. He made a decision, not about Patrick. Patrick was a thread he would cut cleanly and without sentiment, because Patrick was now a liability rather than a need, and cutting liabilities was something he had always been willing to do. The decision was about the journal itself. He carried it to the kitchen. He stood at the counter for a moment looking at it, 15 years of careful documentation in his own hand, the complete architecture of everything he had built and maintained and protected, and he felt something he had not expected to feel, which was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a thing ending that had been the primary structure of your interior world for so long that ending it was a kind of self-erasure. He opened the cabinet beneath the sink. He took out the fireproof document box he kept there for important papers, and he placed the journal inside it and locked it and put it back. He was not ready to destroy it yet. He was not sure he would ever be ready to destroy it. That, he understood with the cold, honest clarity he brought to his own assessments, was a weakness, a real one. The first real one he had acknowledged in 15 years. He went to the window. Codgerwealth Avenue was wet and quiet below him, the streetlights casting their orange light across the puddles, a few figures moving through the rain with their heads down. Ordinary Thursday evening. Ordinary Boston, indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware. He thought about Donnie's reply. He thought about the journal in the fireproof box. He thought about the pressure and the narrowing window and the decision he had made, and the one he had not yet made, and the specific calculus of a man who had always known the run ended somewhere and was now standing at the coordinates he had always abstractly known existed, and finding them more concrete than abstract had prepared him for. He picked up his phone. He did not call Patrick. He had already moved that thread to a safe distance earlier in the week, a brief and warm text to Patrick, explaining that his connection at Boston Family Services had given him the wrong number and apologizing for the confusion. Patrick had replied with a brief no problem, and that had been the end of it. Clean, simple, a thread cut without residue. He called someone else the number he had not called in 2 years. A number that connected him to a specific kind of resource that a man with his particular history sometimes needed to maintain access to without ever wanting to actually use. The number rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and he left no message and hung up. He looked at the rain. He thought about Donnie Rise, sitting in her apartment 11 blocks away, possibly sleeping, possibly not sleeping, possibly looking at photographs on her phone that she had taken in his office this afternoon while he had been with his 3:30 client. He thought about the worn corner of the journal cover. He thought about Tuesday evening and the eye contact that had lasted 2 seconds and the performance behind her eyes that he had identified too late to do anything about. He thought that she was, in the specific and terrible way of the thing he found himself in, extraordinary. He went to bed. He did not sleep either. Frank got the call from Coelho at 7:15 Thursday evening. He was at his kitchen table with his legal pad and his cold coffee and the accumulated notes of 3 weeks of careful watching, and he listened to Coelho's account of the journal access and the warrant application and the text Marcus had sent Donnie, and he said nothing until Coelho had finished. Then he said, "He knows. He suspects," Coelho said. "He knows," Frank said, with the flat certainty of a man who had spent 22 years in rooms with people and had learned the difference between suspicion and knowledge by the specific way each one moved. The invitation to the office tomorrow is not information gathering. Information gathering was the text to Donnie. The office invitation is the next step after information gathering. He's already made his assessment. A silence. "What's his next step?" Coelho said. Not a question exactly. The sound of a man who had his own answer and wanted Frank's. Frank looked at his legal pad, at the third column with Marcus Hale at the top and the bullet points and the double underlined instruction at the bottom. "He has 2 options," Frank said. "He runs or he moves on someone who gives him leverage, someone he can use to create distance between himself and whatever you're building." He paused. "He won't run, not yet. Running means abandoning 15 years of infrastructure, and he's not ready for that. So he moves on someone." "He moves on someone," Frank said. "The question is who." The silence this time was different. The silence of 2 men arriving at the same answer from different directions. "Donnie," Coelho said. "She's the variable he can't read," Frank said. "Everything else in his world right now is either known or manageable. She's the one thing he hasn't been able to fully assess, and that's intolerable to a man like him. He'll want to resolve the ambiguity. The warrant comes through at 9 tomorrow morning, at the earliest, I know. I have a car on her street. A car on her street is good," Frank said. "But a car on her street is a response. If he moves tonight, a response is what you have." He looked at the rain on his kitchen window, steady and gray and patient. "I'm closer to her building than B2. Coelho was quiet for a moment. "Frank," he said carefully. "I'm a retired man with bad knees taking an evening walk," Frank said. "There's no law against that." Another silence, longer this time. "The car will be on Tremont Street side," Coelho said. "If you happen to be in that neighborhood tonight, the south entrance of her building would not be covered." Frank was already reaching for his coat. "Get the warrant," he said. "I'll keep the south entrance company." He hung up and put on his coat and found his keys and stood for a moment at the kitchen table, looking at the legal pad with its columns and its double underlined instruction. "Do not approach, do not signal, watch only." He had written that for a reason, and the reason was still valid, and he had just agreed to something that was not quite in violation of it, and was not quite within it either, which was the specific kind of ethical geography he had navigated his entire career, and which he had never found clean and had always found necessary. He picked up the legal pad and put it in the kitchen drawer. He went out into the rain. The night passed. In a judge's home office in Newton, a 63-year-old woman read 24 pages of documented pattern and eyewitness account and handwriting analysis and cold case connections and sat for a long time afterward with the application on her desk and the specific weight of what she was being asked to authorize settling around her. She had been on the bench for 19 years. She had signed warrants that had ended careers, and warrants that had saved lives, and warrants that had done both simultaneously, and she had learned to carry the weight of them without being crushed by it. This one was heavier than most. not because the evidence was insufficient. Because the evidence was, when read in its full accumulated shape, the portrait of something that had been operating in plain sight for 15 years in a city of 700,000 people, and had been stopped not by the systems designed to stop such things, but by a retired detective with bad knees, and a young woman with good instincts, and a detective who had looked at 2 names on a handwritten list, and decided they were worth his Thursday evening. She initialed the last page at 11:47, that she would have her clerk file it first thing in the morning. She went to bed and did not sleep easily, and in the morning she would not remember her dreams, but she would carry the weight of the applications. In the specific way, she carried all the applications, as a reminder that the distance between ordinary life and its opposite was smaller than most people needed it to be. Donnie heard the footsteps in the hallway at 2:14 in the morning. She was not asleep. She was lying in the dark of her bedroom, listening to the rain and the building sounds, and the particular quality of 2 in the morning silence that was different from midnight silence, in the way that deep cold was different from ordinary cold, more absolute, more honest about what it was. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She sat up. She reached for her phone on the nightstand. Coelho's number was already open, already 1 tap from dialing, because she had fallen asleep holding it 2 hours ago and had woken with it still in her hand. The footsteps did not move. Whoever was in the hallway was standing still outside her door and had been standing still for long enough that the building's motion sensor light in the corridor, which clicked off after 90 seconds of no movement, had gone dark. She was in the dark. They were in the dark. She pressed call. Act 4, Session 2, the window between. Coelho answered on the first ring. She could hear him already moving. The specific sound of a man going from seated to standing in a single motion, keys in hand before the call connected. Footsteps in the hall, she said. Her voice was low and even, and she was quietly astonished by this for the second time in a week. Outside my door, motion sensor light is off. They've been still for at least 2 minutes. Don't open the door, Coelho said. He was already talking to someone else on another line, his voice splitting its attention with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She heard him say Tremont side, north hallway, possible contact, move now. Frank is outside, he said to her. South entrance. I have a unit on Tremont. Somebody is moving right now. She sat in the dark with the phone pressed to her ear and looked at the thin line of light under her bedroom door that was not there because the hallway light was off, and felt the specific quality of a silence that had weight and intention in it rather than the ordinary absence of sound. Donnie, Coelho said, I need you to move to the bathroom. Interior wall, no windows, take your phone, go now quietly. She moved. She knew her apartment in the dark the way you knew a space you had lived in for 3 years, by the specific distances and the particular sounds of the floorboards, and the location of every object that could be walked into. She moved through the bedroom doorway and down the short hall to the bathroom, without touching a wall or making a sound she did not intend to make, and she pulled the bathroom door closed behind her and sat on the floor with her back against the bathtub and the phone still at her ear. I'm in, she said. Good, Coelho said. Stay there. Do not open any door for anyone until you hear my voice. She sat on the bathroom floor in the dark and listened. The building was quiet in the specific way of 2 in the morning. The deep-settled quiet of a structure full of sleeping people who did not know what was happening in one of its hallways. She could hear the rain on the bathroom window above her. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear distantly the sound of the street door below opening, and then the specific acoustic change of someone entering the building's stairwell, footsteps on the stairs, more than one set, moving fast and quiet in the way of trained people who moved fast and quiet as a professional condition. Then a voice in the hallway outside her apartment, not loud, cleared out Frank's voice. Building secure, he said to her through the door. To Coelho through the phone simultaneously she understood. It was the upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Amara. She has insomnia. She was in the hall getting water from the communal filter at the end of the corridor, and she stood there for a while looking at her phone. A pause. She's 81, and she says sorry for the trouble. Donnie put her forehead on her knees. She breathed. She heard Coelho exhale on the phone, the second time she had heard that specific sound from him, and it struck her that it was the most human thing she had learned about him in the course of knowing him, that his relief expressed itself as breath rather than words. You're okay, he said. I'm okay, she said. She was sitting on her bathroom floor at 2:15 in the morning, talking to a detective on the phone, while a retired detective with bad knees stood in her hallway. In the rain-soaked coat, he had apparently walked across half of Boston in on a Thursday night to stand outside a door she had not needed him to stand outside of. She thought she might cry. She did not cry. She stood up and opened the bathroom door and walked to the front door of her apartment and opened it. Frank was in the hallway. large and deliberate and slightly damp, his coat carrying the specific smell of cold rain and night air. He looked at her with the steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything and said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Amara," she said. 81 years old, Frank said. Reads the news on her phone at 2 in the morning because the world is alarming and she finds it better to know than not to know. He looked at her steadily. Sensible woman. Donnie leaned against the doorframe. "You walked here," she said. "I was in the neighborhood," Frank said. She looked at him for a moment with the full complicated weight of everything she knew about what he had been doing for the past 3 weeks. The surveillance and the legal pad and the booth in the West Roxbury bar and the night walk in the rain, and she said, "Thank you, Frank." He nodded once, brief and complete. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." The warrant came through at 8:52. Coelho was at his desk at B2 when his phone rang, and the clerk from Judge Mendez's office read him the authorization in the careful, precise language of official confirmation, and he wrote down the case number and said "thank you," and hung up and sat for a moment with the warrant number on his legal pad, looking at it the way you looked at something you had been working toward for 2 weeks and had not fully believed you would hold until you were holding it. Then he picked up the phone and called Salgado. "We have it," he said. She said she had a team of 4 ready and had been ready since 7. She said the office warrant covered Suite 204 in its entirety, including all documents, notebooks, files, electronic devices, and personal effects present on the premises. The residential warrant covered the Commonwealth Avenue apartment, including all rooms, storage, and personal effects. He said he would meet her on Newbury Street at 10:45. He called Frank. Frank answered on the second ring and said he was already on Newbury Street because he had not gone home after the false alarm at Danny's building, and had walked to a coffee place on Boylston at 6 in the morning when it opened and had been within 2 blocks of the Newbury Street building since 7. Coelho told him the warrant had come through. Frank said, "Good." "I need you to stay outside," Coelho said. "You're not on this team. You're a civilian and a witness, and if you're inside during the execution, it creates problems for the case." "I know," Frank said. "I'll be on the sidewalk, Frank, on the sidewalk," Frank said. "I promise." Coelho called Donnie last. She answered immediately, which told him she had not slept after the 2 in the morning episode, or had slept and had been awake since first light, which was functionally the same thing. He told her the warrant had come through and would execute at 11. He told her she did not need to be there and should not be there, and that he would call her when it was done. She said she understood. She was on Newbury Street at 10:30. Marcus had a client at 9. He had considered canceling. He had held the consideration for approximately 4 minutes on Friday morning over his first cup of coffee and then dismissed it because canceling was deviation and deviation was signal, and he was not yet at the point where deviation was less dangerous than routine. The window was still open. The warrant, if it existed, had not executed. The morning was ordinary. He would make it ordinary by moving through it ordinarily. His 9 o'clock was a man named William, 67, widower, 8 months out. The slow, careful work of a man learning to inhabit a life that had been restructured by absence. Marcus sat across from William in Suite 204 for 50 minutes and listened with his full and total attention and said the right things at the right moments and guided the session with the precision and warmth that had made him, in the genuine assessment of everyone who had ever worked with him or been helped by him, an exceptional clinician. He was not performing with William. That was the complexity of Marcus Hale, that no profile had ever fully captured, and that he had never fully resolved in himself. The thing he did in the room with his clients was real. The skill was real. The ability to hold someone's pain and give it back to them in a form they could carry was a genuine capacity that he had developed and refined, and that produced real outcomes for real people in real pain. It coexisted with everything else without apparent contradiction. He had stopped trying to reconcile the two things a long time ago. William left at 10:10. Marcus walked him to the elevator and said goodbye and stood in the second-floor hallway for a moment after the elevator doors closed. The building was quiet in the mid-morning way. The yoga studio's 10 o'clock class was audible as a faint rhythmic presence through the wall, a low instructional voice, and the movement of bodies on wooden floors. He went back into Suite 204. He stood in the middle of the room, the circle of chairs, the tea table, the amber light from the floor lamps that had made hundreds of people feel, in this specific room, that they were held. He went to the desk. He opened the center drawer. The journal was not there. He had not put it there this morning. He had put it in the fireproof box at home and had come to work without it for the first time in 3 weeks, because he had made a decision about it last night that he had not yet fully enacted and that required him to not be carrying it when he enacted it. He stood at the desk and looked at the empty center drawer and thought about what was in the fireproof box in his kitchen cabinet, and what it would mean if it remained there, and what it would mean if it did not. He had 40 minutes before his gap ended and his 11:30 client arrived. He made a decision. He picked up his coat. He left the office. Coelho's team arrived on Newbury Street at 10:43, 4 plainclothes officers in Salgado who had driven over from B6 with the particular focused energy of a detective who had been working a cold case for 3 years and was about to see it move. Coelho met them on the sidewalk, and they stood in a brief cluster in the gray morning light, and he walked them through the execution sequence, and they moved. He had a unit waiting outside the Commonwealth Avenue address simultaneously. Both warrants would execute at 11 sharp, office and residence together, no gap between them that a phone call could fill. He looked at his watch, 10:58. He looked up and down Newbury Street. Frank was at the corner of Dartmouth, hands in his coat pockets, watching the building with the still unhurried attention of a man waiting for a bus. He met Coelho's eyes briefly across the distance and gave nothing away and looked back at the building. Donnie was 20 feet further down the block on the opposite side of the street, collar up, standing in the shelter of a shop doorway. She had not said she would be there, and Coelho had told her she should not be there. And she was there, and he understood it completely and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that she did not already know. 11 o'clock. Coelho and his team went into the building. They took the stairs. They reached the second-floor hallway and approached Suite 204, and Coelho knocked twice with the flat authority of a man holding a warrant and said, "Boston Police, search warrant," and tried the door and found it unlocked, which was not what he had expected, and pushed it open. The room was empty. Floor lamps on. Circle of chairs, tea table, the smell of bergamot from the yoga studio. Everything in its place with the managed precision of a room that was also a performance. The desk was empty. The center drawer was open. Coelho stood in the doorway for 1 second, and then he was on his radio, and the Commonwealth Avenue unit was executing simultaneously. And Salgado's team was moving through the suite with the focused efficiency of a practiced search, and Coelho was back in the hallway dialing his phone. Marcus was not here. Marcus had left. He was on the red line. He had taken the Boylston Street entrance to the green line at 10:22 and transferred to the red line at Park Street, and he was sitting in a southbound train with his coat on and his hands on his knees and the specific interior quiet of a man who had made his final decision and was moving toward its execution. The fireproof box. He had thought about the fireproof box for most of the night and had arrived in the gray early morning hours at the honest conclusion he had been avoiding since the moment he had placed the journal inside it. He could not destroy it. Not because the destruction was logistically difficult, it was not. A box of documents in a kitchen sink took 20 minutes and left nothing. But because the journal was 15 years of the only interior life he had, and destroying it was a form of death he was not willing to perform while alternatives existed. The alternative was taking it somewhere it could not be found. He had a storage unit in Quincy. Rented under the name Daniel Marsh 18 months ago, paid in money orders, visited twice in that time. It held 2 contractor bags that he had been meaning to deal with and had not dealt with because dealing with them required a kind of logistical effort that he had always found it easier to defer. The bags were the only real vulnerability in the unit. The journal would be a different kind of storage. The journal was paper and ink and careful handwriting, and it could sit in a locked unit in Quincy for years without generating attention. He got off at JFK UMass and transferred to the Braintree branch. His phone was off. He had turned it off at 10:15, which was something he had planned the previous night as part of the decision, the specific moment at which he would step out of the traceable grid of his ordinary life and into the space he had always maintained for contingencies. He rode south. He thought about the room on Newbury Street with the amber floor lamps and the circle of chairs and the hundreds of people who had sat in that circle and found something bearable there. He thought about it with something that was not quite grief and not quite pride, and was adjacent to both in the way his feelings were always adjacent to their names. He thought about Donnie. He thought about her with the cold, honest assessment he brought to all his thinking, and arrived at the conclusion he had been approaching for a week, which was that she was the most dangerous person he had ever been in a room with, not because she was aggressive or confrontational or even consciously investigative, but because she was the specific kind of perceptive that did not know it was perceptive, and therefore could not be managed through the usual channels. You could manage someone who knew they were suspicious. You could not fully manage someone who felt wrong without knowing why, who sat with the feeling rather than acting on it or dismissing it, who let the instinct do its slow, patient work beneath the surface of a performance that was itself extraordinary. He thought that under different circumstances he would have found her remarkable. He thought that under these circumstances, she had done exactly what a remarkable person would do, which was sit 3 feet away from something terrible and not look away. The train reached Quincy Center at 11:17. He did not know that at 11:14 a unit from the Boston Police Department had arrived at his Commonwealth Avenue building, and that his apartment door had been opened with a warrant, and that 2 officers were standing in his kitchen, looking at a cabinet beneath the sink that contained a fireproof document box with a combination lock. He did not know that Salgado was on the phone with a locksmith. He did not know that the storage unit in Quincy was already in the system because the name Daniel Marsh had come up in the warrant application supporting materials, and a Quincy PD unit had been dispatched to the facility at 10:50. He walked out of the Quincy Center station into the gray midday light and turned south toward the storage facility and felt the cold air on his face and the specific quality of a man who had made his decision and was executing it, and had not yet learned that the decision was already moot. His phone was off. He walked 4 blocks. He turned onto the street where the storage facility sat behind its chain-link fence and its keypad gate, and he saw the Quincy PD unit in the parking lot, and the 2 officers standing beside it, and the facility manager talking to them with the cooperative urgency of someone who had been asked questions and had answered them, and was now watching the answers produce consequences. He stopped. He stood on the sidewalk in the gray November light, with the cold coming off the pavement and the distant sound of a red line train pulling out of the station 4 blocks behind him, and he looked at the Quincy PD unit and the officers and the facility manager and understood, with the cold absolute clarity of a man whose most reliable instrument had never once failed him until now, that the window had closed. He stood very still for a long moment, then he turned around. Coelho got the call from Quincy PD at 11:21. Visual on a male subject matching the description, on foot, 4 blocks from the storage facility, turning back north toward the station. He had 2 things simultaneously: a subject on foot in Quincy walking toward the red line, and a fireproof box in a cabinet in a Commonwealth Avenue apartment that a locksmith was cutting open right now. He made a choice. He called the Quincy units and told them to move, and he called Salgado and told her to stay on the box, and he stood on the Newberry Street sidewalk outside an empty Suite 204 and looked at Frank across the street and held up his phone. And Frank read the gesture the way a detective read a gesture and started walking toward him. "Quincy," Coelho said when Frank reached him. "He went for the storage unit. Quincy PD has eyes on him." Frank looked at him with the steady attention of a man processing and deciding simultaneously. "He'll run for the station," he said. "He's 4 blocks out. If he gets on a train before Quincy PD closes the distance, he could be anywhere on the red line in 12 minutes. Coelho was already calling the T. Donnie appeared beside them from the shop doorway across the street. She did not ask what was happening. She read it from their faces with the instinct that had been working on something for 6 weeks and had been right about it the entire time. "He's running," she said. "Not yet," Frank said, "but close." The 3 of them stood on the Newberry Street sidewalk in the gray morning light, a detective and a retired detective and a young woman with good instincts, and waited for the phone to tell them what happened next. Act 4, Session 3, the end of the run. Marcus walked north toward Quincy Center Station with the specific, unhurried pace of a man who had somewhere to be and no reason to run, which was the pace he had always used when the situation required him to be invisible, and which had served him without exception for 15 years. He thought about the storage facility and the Quincy PD unit and the facility manager talking to the officers with the cooperative urgency of someone answering questions that were already producing consequences. He thought about what the unit's presence meant in terms of what the police already knew and what they were building toward, and arrived at the conclusion that the storage unit had been in the warrant materials, which meant the journal in the fireproof box at the apartment was also in the warrant materials, which meant the apartment had been entered simultaneously, and the box was either open or being opened right now. He walked. He thought about what was in the journal. He thought about it with the cold, honest clarity of a man who had written every word of it himself, and who understood precisely what its contents would mean in the hands of a prosecutor with a full case file and a motivated district attorney and a jury of 12 people from the city he had moved through for 15 years. He turned onto the block that held the station entrance. He did not run. Running was losing. Running was the confirmation of guilt that observation alone could not provide. Running was the one thing you did not do when the alternative was the possibility, however thin, that the situation was still manageable. He had managed situations that appeared unmanageable before. He had managed them through stillness and patience and the absolute unwavering performance of a man with nothing to hide. He reached the station entrance. He took the stairs down. The platform was mid-morning quiet, a handful of commuters spaced along its length. A woman with a stroller, two men in construction gear, an older man reading a folded newspaper with the focused concentration of someone who had not yet switched to a phone and never intended to. The northbound board showed a train arriving in 3 minutes, 3 minutes. He stood at the edge of the platform and looked north into the dark of the tunnel and felt the faint movement of air that preceded a train, and thought about 3 minutes and what 3 minutes contained and what came after it. He heard the footsteps on the stairs behind him, not rushing, measured, the specific cadence of trained people moving with purpose through a public space in a way designed not to produce panic. He had heard that cadence before, in the abstract, in the case files he had read over the years, in the profiles and the narratives and the accounts of other men in other stations at other ends of other runs. He had always believed, in the irrational certain way of someone who had never been caught, that he would not hear it aimed at him. He turned around. 2 Quincy PD officers, plain clothes, badges visible now, moving toward him from the stairwell with the contained professional energy of people executing a practiced approach. A third officer appearing from the far end of the platform where he had been waiting, positioned to cover the distance between Marcus and the tunnel's edge. Marcus stood very still. He thought about running. The calculation lasted approximately 1 second, and produced the answer it always produced when examined honestly, which was that running was over. Not because they were faster, though they likely were, because running was the end of the version of himself that had always been, in the most fundamental way, a man who controlled the room. Running was losing the room, and losing the room was the only thing Marcus Hale had never been willing to do. The first officer reached him and said his name, and said the words that followed his name in the sequence they were legally required to be said, and Marcus listened to them with the focused attention he brought to everything, and said nothing. They turned him. They were professional and unhurried about it. The platform continued its mid-morning indifference around them, the woman with the stroller moving to the far end, the construction workers watching with the frank, open curiosity of people who had decided not to pretend they weren't watching, the older man with the newspaper looking over his folded paper with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but was the expression of a man revising his assessment of the morning. Marcus felt the cuffs click into place. He looked north into the tunnel, where the air was moving now with the imminence of the approaching train. The distant light growing in the dark, the sound building from nothing to something to the full roar of a red line train arriving at Quincy Center Station on a gray Friday morning in April. He thought about the journal. He thought about 15 years of careful handwriting pressed between 2 covers in a fireproof box in a cabinet in an apartment on Commonwealth Avenue where 2 officers were standing right now. He thought about Ruth's window boxes with the dying plants. He thought about Carol's hands in her jacket pocket, closing around something small she needed to touch. He thought about Donnie Rise sitting 3 feet away from him for 6 weeks with the stillness of a woman who was feeling something she could not yet name and letting it do its slow, patient work. He thought about all of it with the cold, detached clarity that had been his primary instrument for 15 years, and found that the clarity, for the first time, was not producing distance. The train arrived, the doors opened up, passengers got off, and passengers got on, and the doors closed, and the train pulled out, and Marcus Hale stood on the platform at Quincy Center Station in handcuffs, and watched it go with the expression of a man who understood that there were no more trains for him. Coelho's phone rang at 11:29. He was still on Newberry Street, Frank beside him, Donnie 3 feet away with her arms crossed and her eyes on his face, reading his expression as he answered. He listened for 45 seconds and said thank you and hung up. He looked at Frank. Frank looked back at him with the steady, unhurried patience of a man who had been waiting 22 years for a specific kind of phone call and had just watched it arrive. Quincy Center platform, Coelho said. He's in custody. Frank nodded once. Donnie let out a breath. Not a dramatic breath. The small, quiet kind that a person released when something they had been holding for a very long time was no longer required to be held. She looked at the Newberry Street sidewalk for a moment, and then at the building, and then at the gray morning sky above it, and said nothing. Doc Coelho's phone rang again. Salgado. The box is open, she said. He could hear something in her voice that was not quite controlled, the specific quality of a person who had spent 3 years on a cold case, and was standing in the moment where the cold case was cold no longer. Ray, the journal is here, it's intact. It goes back further than Rourke. There's a name from 14 years ago, a woman named Margaret Fell. I don't have her in the system yet, but she's here, she's documented. Coelho closed his eyes for 1 second. How many? He said on silence. I'm counting, Salgado said quietly. I'm still counting. The journal contained 22 names. That number would take 4 days of cross-referencing to confirm, 4 days during which Coelho and Salgado and 3 additional detectives worked through the names and dates and operational notes in Marcus's careful handwriting against missing persons databases and cold case files from 6 districts across the Boston metro area and 2 cases from Providence that had never been connected to anything in Massachusetts. 22 names across 14 years. The earliest entry was a woman named Margaret Fell, 61, Jamaica Plain, 14 years ago, documented with the same cold precision as every entry that followed her, a circle, a line, a date, a word. The most recent completed entry was Ruth Callahan between them. 20 entries in Marcus's careful hand, each one a life reduced to its operational components and filed with the specific terrible tidiness of a man who valued order above everything. Coelho read all 22 entries in a single sitting at his desk at B2 on a Friday evening after the warrant had executed and Marcus was processed, and the case file was building its weight in the organized archive of a prosecution that the Dawes office had already described in a conversation with Coelho that afternoon as the most significant case the city had seen in a decade. He read all 22, and then he sat for a long time in the particular silence of a man who had needed to know the full scope and had found it and now carried it. He thought about the families, the sisters in Portland and Ohio and Providence, the neighbors who had noticed and not known what they had noticed, the missing persons reports that had been filed and had gone nowhere, for reasons that were not the fault of the detectives who had worked them and were not the fault of anyone except the man who had engineered the specific invisibility that had made them go nowhere. He thought about Gerald and Carol and Frank sitting in a circle every Tuesday evening in a room that was also an instrument. He thought about Priya, who had lost her mother and had found something bearable in that room, and who had not known what the room was. He thought about all the people who would now need to understand what they had been part of without having chosen to be part of it, and about the specific kind of grief that produced, which was not like any other grief because it contained within it the impossible task of reconciling the help that had been real with the horror that had coexisted with it. He closed the case file. He went home and told Rose's photograph on the mantelpiece that it had been a long couple of weeks, and that he thought she would have found the whole thing both appalling and instructive, and that he missed her specific way of being right about him. He went to bed. He slept without difficulty for the first time in 2 weeks. The Mending Boston group met one final time the following Tuesday, not in Suite 204, which was still sealed as an active crime scene with yellow tape across the frosted glass door and the small printed placard that read Dr. M. Hale, Elmsey sitting in its bracket with the particular quality of a thing that had been significant and was now evidence. They met in a conference room at Boston Family Services that Donnie's supervisor had offered without question when Donnie had explained what was needed, which was a room and some chairs and enough time for 4 people to sit with something enormous and not be alone with it. Carl came. She had not known when she arrived that the news about Trevor would be waiting there, delivered by Coelho in the careful language of a man who had done this before and had never stopped finding it the hardest part of the work. She had known, in the way people know things before they are confirmed, in the way grief has its own intelligence that operates below the level of official notification. She received the confirmation with the stillness of someone who had been preparing for it for weeks and who was now on the other side of the preparing, where the actual thing lived. Jarrold sat beside her. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said Ruth's name once, quietly, and let it sit in the room the way the names of the dead deserve to sit, with space around them and without the pressure of resolution. Frank sat with his large hands loose in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance and said nothing for most of the hour and said, toward the end of it, that he had known something was wrong and had not acted quickly enough on knowing and that he would carry that. He said it in the flat, complete way. He said everything, without self-pity and without absolution seeking. Just the acknowledgement, clean and honest and placed in the room for what it was. Donnie told him that he had acted, that his legal pad and his surveillance and his call to Coelho had been the architecture on which the case had been built. That without what he had built, they would not have had what they needed in time. Frank looked at her for a moment. You opened the drawer, he said she had. There was nothing to add to that, and nobody tried to add anything to it. It sat in the conference room at Boston Family Services on a Tuesday evening in April the way true things sat, without needing to be elaborated or defended or made larger than they were. They stayed for 90 minutes. When they left, Donnie stood in the hallway for a moment watching them go, Carol and Gerald walking out together toward the elevator, Frank taking the stairs with the careful deliberateness of his bad knees, and she felt the specific complicated quality of an ending that was not clean, that contained within it all the things that endings containing real loss contained, which was grief and relief, and the long, difficult work that came after both, she went back to her desk. She had 3 case reviews to write and a supervision meeting tomorrow morning, and a continuing education log that still needed to be updated for her licensure renewal, the same task that had started all of this on an ordinary evening when she had gone to the Mending Boston website looking for a founding date and had found instead the name of a sister who did not exist. She opened her laptop. She started with the continuing education log. She documented the placement, the dates, the clinical hours, the name of the practice, and the name of its facilitator. She paused with her fingers on the keyboard for a moment. Then she completed the entry and moved to the next task, and the next in the evening moved forward around her in the ordinary way of evenings that came after extraordinary things, which was with the patient indifference of time that did not adjust its pace for the magnitude of what it was carrying outside on Washington Street. Boston moved through its Tuesday evening, the city's great continuous noise absorbing everything without distinction. 700,000 people in 700,000 versions of their ordinary lives, the distance between those lives and their opposites smaller than most of them needed it to be, and larger tonight by exactly 1. Marcus Ellen Hale was arraigned on a Friday morning in Suffolk Superior Court in a proceeding that lasted 40 minutes and produced a not guilty plea delivered in his customary voice, which was low and unhurried and warm without being performative, and which landed in the courtroom with the specific dissonance of a sound that belonged to one room being played in another. The bail request was denied. He was remanded to custody and led from the courtroom by 2 officers with the professional, unhurried efficiency of people who had done this many times and found no drama in the doing of it. He walked between them with the particular stillness of a man who had decided that whatever came next would be met with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything. Not at the door of the courtroom, he paused. One of the officers said something, and he moved again, and then he was through the door and gone. The courtroom emptied Doxoello sat in the gallery for a moment after the room had cleared, the specific quiet of a large room that had been full and was now not, and thought about the 22 names and the families who were now receiving the phone calls that closed the cases that had been open for months and years, and in one instance 14 years, and about the specific quality of that kind of closing, which was not resolution exactly and was not peace exactly, but was the thing that came before both of them and that had no better name than the truth. He thought about Donnie's text from the Dartmouth streetcar. 3 words, I have it. He thought about Frank on the Quincy Center platform in his imagination, which was the only place Frank had been since he had stayed on the Newbury Street sidewalk and kept his promise, watching the thing he had built toward for 3 weeks, arrive at its conclusion from 2 blocks away, and keeping the promise he had made and saying nothing and going home. He thought about Carol and Gerald and Priya, and the room they had all sat in every Tuesday evening for months and years, the room that had been real in every way a room could be real, and that had been something else underneath its reality. And he thought about what it meant to have found something true in a place that was also false, and whether the truth survived the place. He thought it did. He thought truth was like that, inconvenient in its persistence, surviving the conditions that tried to negate it, remaining in the people who had experienced it even after the context that had produced it was gone. He stood up. He picked up his coat. He walked out of Suffolk Superior Court into the gray April morning and stood on the steps for a moment with the city spread out below him. Boston in its ordinary Friday, indifferent and continuous, and entirely unaware of the specific thing that had just concluded in the building behind him, the long run that had ended on a platform in Quincy and a drawer on Newbury Street and a bathroom floor at 2 a.m. and a booth in a West Roxbury bar and 1,000 small moments of ordinary perception that had refused finally to be dismissed. He walked down the steps. He had a desk full of paper waiting for him at B2. He went to work. What the Grieving Leave Behind. Act 5, Session 1, New Shapes. The trial was 14 months away. That was the number the assistant district attorney gave Donnie when she called to discuss her testimony. 14 months from arraignment to opening arguments. The specific bureaucratic distance between the truth and its official recognition. She wrote it on a notepad and looked at it for a moment, and then put the notepad in a drawer and went back to work because 14 months was 14 months, and the space between now and then needed to be lived in rather than waded through. She stayed at Boston Family Services through the summer. She kept her caseload and her supervision meetings and her continuing education log and the ordinary professional rhythms that had always been the structure her life moved inside. She went to her own therapy, which she had been doing since graduate school, and which took on a different quality after April. Deeper and less comfortable and more honest, which her therapist described as exactly right, and which Donnie described as exhausting, and which they agreed were the same thing. She thought about Marcus less than she expected to. Not because what he had done was small, or because her proximity to it was small, but because she had developed, in the 6 weeks of sitting 3 feet away from it, a specific relationship to the thing that was not denial and not exposure and was somewhere between them, a way of holding it that allowed her to keep moving without pretending it was not there. She thought about Ruth more, about all of them, but Ruth most specifically, perhaps because Ruth was the one whose story she had been closest to in real time, whose peripheral presence in Gerald's group narratives she had absorbed without knowing, whose window boxes of dying plants she had seen in a photograph in a police file, and had not been able to stop seeing since. She thought about what Ruth had told her sister on the phone the night before she disappeared. "It's nothing. He's just a regular customer." She thought about the specific cruelty of hope in the wrong direction, and about whether hope in the wrong direction was still hope, and decided that it was, that Ruth had been right to feel what she had felt, that the warmth was real even if the source of it was not, that the lightness she had described to her sister was a true thing that had happened in a false context, and that the truth of it belonged to Ruth and not to Marcus, and could not be taken from her by what came after. She was not sure she fully believed this. She was working on it. Frank testified before the grand jury in June. He delivered his account in the careful sequential way. He delivered everything, facts in order, qualifications placed correctly, no conclusion dressed as observation. And when it was done, he walked out of the building into a hot Boston summer morning and called Coelho and said it was done. And Coelho said good, and they agreed to get a beer sometime, and both of them knew they would not get around to it for months, and that when they did, it would be the specific kind of comfortable that came from having moved through something difficult together and come out the other side intact. Frank's knees got worse in August. He finally went to the doctor, who told him what Rosa had been telling him for 3 years, which was that the knees required surgery, and the surgery required rest, and the rest required him to stop treating his body like a piece of equipment that would function indefinitely, if not directly addressed. He scheduled the surgery for September. He canceled it once, rescheduled it, and went through with it in October. He recovered in his apartment in West Roxbury with a physical therapist who came 3 times a week, and who reminded him in specific small ways of the best young detectives he had worked with, which was to say she trusted her instincts and doubted her conclusions in exactly the right proportions, and was thorough about everything, without making thoroughness the point. He kept the legal pad in the kitchen drawer. He did not throw it away. Gerald identified Ruth's remains in May through the investigation's follow-on work, which had located the specific location documented in Marcus's journal with the cold operational precision of a man who had always known exactly where everything was. He attended a small service organized by Ruth's sister, who had come down from Portland and who Gerald met for the first time in a church hall in Jamaica Plain, where people who had known Ruth in the small particular ways you knew. A neighbor brought food and photographs, and the stories that accumulated around a life lived quietly in one neighborhood for 22 years. Gerald spoke briefly at the service. He talked about the Sunday tea and the garden in the building's backyard and the socks, and whether they had any reasonable hope this season, which they did not. And he said that Ruth had always known that and had never stopped hoping anyway, which he offered as the specific and complete summary of her character that it was. He drove home afterward and sat at his kitchen table and opened his notebook to a fresh page and sat with the pen in his hand. For a long time, he wrote her name at the top. He did not write anything else. He closed the notebook and put it away and made dinner and ate it at the table where they had drunk tea on Sunday mornings, and looked at the chair across from him, and felt the specific weight of a room that had held someone and no longer did, which was the weight he had been learning to carry for 2 years now, and which did not get lighter exactly, but became, over time, more familiar, less surprising in its presence, more integrated into the shape of an ordinary day. He thought that was probably what integration felt like from the inside. He thought Ruth would have had something sensible to say about it. Carol got the call about Trevor in May as well. The identification had taken longer than Ruth's, because the documentation in Marcus's journal for Trevor was older, and the location noted had required additional investigation to confirm. Coelho called her himself. He had thought about having the Ada make the call, and had decided against it, because Carol had been in his case from the beginning, her name at the top of Gerald's handwritten list, her missing persons inquiry the first thread that had connected to the pattern. And she deserved to hear it from someone who understood the full shape of what she had lost, and how long she had been losing it. She was quiet on the phone for a long time after he told her. Then she said, I think I knew the first time I filed the inquiry. Coelho said. He thought she probably had, she said. He sat there every Tuesday. He handed me tissues. Coelho said yes. She said nothing else for a moment. Then she said thank you, and hung up, and Coelho sat with the phone in his hand and thought about the specific cost of what Marcus had done that was not in any case file, that could not be prosecuted or sentenced or documented in official language, which was the specific corruption of the one place a person in grief was supposed to be safe. The room that was supposed to hold you, the warmth that was supposed to be real. Carol went back to work in June. She took leave in August to handle Trevor's arrangements, and came back in September and continued the slow, difficult work of living inside a grief that now had its full shape, which was heavier than the ambiguous grief of not knowing, and also, in the specific way of confirmed things, more possible to carry. You could not carry what you could not name. You could carry almost anything you could name if you were willing to learn how. She did not go to another support group. She did not rule it out permanently. She was not ready yet, and she was honest about not being ready, which was itself a form of progress, the kind that did not look like progress from the outside, but felt like it from the inside, which was the only direction that mattered. Donnie left Boston in September, not because of what had happened, partly because of what had happened, which had clarified things that had been unclear, which was the one reliable service that terrible experiences sometimes performed for the people who survived them. She had been in Boston for 6 years and had built a life there that was good and was also... She understood now with the honest clarity that surviving something produced, not quite the life she had been building toward. She had stayed through graduate school and through her first placement, and through the accumulating inertia of a city you knew well and had stopped choosing and started simply inhabiting. She chose differently. She went to Philadelphia, where her mother's sister lived and where a position had opened at a family services organization that worked specifically with complicated grief populations in communities, with limited mental health resources, which was the specific intersection of her training and her instincts, and the thing she had understood in 6 weeks of Tuesday evenings on Newbury Street that she was actually built for. She found an apartment in West Philadelphia with large windows and no particular view, and a kitchen she liked and a neighborhood she was learning. In the incremental way you learned new neighborhoods, by the specific smell of the coffee place on the corner, and the name of the woman who ran the bookshop 2 blocks over, and the particular quality of the light on the street in the early evening when the day was ending and the city was settling into itself. She called her therapist twice a month by video. She called her mother on Sundays. She went to a yoga class on Wednesday evenings because the studio was 2 blocks from her apartment and the instructor was good, and the specific discipline of an hour of required presence in her own body was something she had learned in the months since April to value in a way she had not previously valued it. She did not avoid grief support groups. She had considered avoiding them in the early months as a form of self-protection, the reasonable response of a person who had learned something terrible about a room they had trusted. She had thought about it carefully and had arrived at the conclusion that the room was not the problem, and had never been the problem, and that the answer to a room being misused was not to stop using rooms, but to understand more clearly what rooms were for. She was a grief counselor. Rooms were her instrument. She would not put it down. The group met on Thursday evenings in a community center on Baltimore Avenue. 8 people in a circle of chairs in a room that smelled of old coffee and the cleaning product the center used on its floors and the particular ambient warmth of a building that was used every day for purposes that mattered. There was no bergamot. There were no amber floor lamps. The overhead fluorescents were on, and the chairs were stackable, and the table in the corner held a coffee carafe that was actually used, and a box of tea and nothing else. Donnie had been attending for 6 weeks. She had not introduced herself as a clinician. She had introduced herself as Dani, which was enough, which was what this room asked of its members, which was only presence and honesty and the willingness to sit with the uncomfortable thing until it either resolved or it didn't. The group was good. The facilitator, a woman named Josephine in her early 60s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the unhurried patience of someone who had been doing this work for a long time, was genuinely skilled in the way that showed up as absence rather than presence, the skill that made itself invisible so that the room itself could be what it needed to be. Donnie found something bearable in it. Not resolution, not the clean arc of a thing completed, the specific, ongoing, bearable quality of a room full of people who understood loss from the inside and did not ask each other to be further along than they were. She had been sitting with the thing that had happened the way you sat, with things that were too large to process directly, in pieces, at an angle, over time. She had been sitting with Ruth and with the 22 names and with the specific, complicated grief of having been inside something terrible and having helped stop it and having not been able to stop it sooner, which were 3 different griefs that required 3 different kinds of sitting with, and that she was working through in the patient incremental way of someone who had learned, in the most direct way available, that grief did not move on a schedule and did not respond to pressure and did not complete itself on anyone's timeline except its own. She sat in the circle on a Thursday evening in November, with the fluorescent lights overhead and the coffee going cold on the table in the corner, and the sound of Baltimore Avenue outside the windows, the city's ordinary Thursday noise, and listened to a man named David describe the 6 months since his wife had died, and felt the familiar pull of the work, the specific quality of attention that grief required, and let it ground her in the room rather than anywhere else. Josephine guided the session with the invisible skill that Donnie had been watching for 6 weeks and continued to find instructive. At 8:45, Josephine said what facilitators said at the end of sessions, the small particular closing that returned the room to the world outside it. And people gathered their coats and their bags and exchanged the brief, genuine contact of people who had been present together in a difficult space and were now returning to their separate versions of ordinary life. Donnie put on her coat. She was at the door when Josephine said her name. She turned. Josephine was at the table, gathering the cups, reading glasses on the chain around her neck, unhurried and complete in the specific way of a woman who had been exactly who she was for long enough that it no longer required any effort. "You're a clinician," Josephine said. It was not a question. Donnie considered denying it for 1 second. "Yes," she said. Josephine nodded once with the expression of a woman confirming something she had already known. "We have an opening for a co-facilitator," she said. "Thursday evenings, if you're interested." Donnie looked at her for a moment. She thought about Newbury Street and the frosted glass door and the small printed placard and the amber floor lamps and the circle of 8 chairs on the round wool rug, and a man adjusting a chair by a quarter inch, who had looked up and smiled, and whose smile had reached his eyes completely. She thought about Ruth. She thought about the room as an instrument, and about what instruments were for, and about the specific and irreplaceable thing that a good room could do for a person in grief, and about whether she was ready to be the person who made the room. She thought she was. She thought she had been ready for a long time and had needed to understand something first. "I'm interested," she said. Josephine smiled and said good, and handed her a cup to stack, and they worked through the end of session, tidying, with the companionable quiet of 2 people who had found a shared purpose without needing to discuss it. At length, and when the room was set back to its neutral state, Donnie said good night and walked out into the November evening. Baltimore Avenue was cold and bright under its streetlights, the city's Thursday evening moving around her in its ordinary way. People in coats and people in cars and the distant sound of a train and the smell of something cooking from the Ethiopian place on the corner that she had not yet tried but had been meaning to. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She took out her phone and called her therapist's voicemail and left a message saying she had something to talk about on their next call. Nothing urgent, something good. She put her phone in her pocket. She walked home. Behind her, the community center on Baltimore Avenue held its Thursday evening quiet. The circle of chairs empty now, the fluorescent lights still on. The coffee carafe cold on the corner table. The room settling into itself, the way rooms did after the people who had needed them had gone. Patient and ready, and waiting for Thursday to come around again. 3 weeks later, Donnie arrived at the community center, 12 minutes early. She stood outside the meeting room door for a moment with her hand on the frame. Not the specific nervous breath of her first Mending Boston session. Something different. Something that knew what it was doing and why, and had made peace with the difficulty of it. She pushed open the door. A man was adjusting a chair. He looked up. He was perhaps 45 slight, with the careful, unhurried posture of someone who had arrived early because he took the work seriously. He had kind eyes and a slight smile, and he said, "Hello, I'm new here." And Donnie said hello, and walked in and began setting up the tea things on the corner table. She did not feel what she had felt the first time she had walked into Suite 204. She felt something else. Attention. The particular quality of presence that good grief work required and that she had been learning to sustain since before she knew she was learning it. She looked at the man adjusting the chair. He adjusted it one more time and seemed satisfied and moved to the next one. Ordinary, unhurried, entirely unremarkable. She watched him for one moment longer than she needed to. Then she turned back to the tea things and finished setting up and listened for the sound of the others arriving, and let the room become what it was, which was a room, which was an instrument, which was in her hands now and would remain there as long as she kept showing up 12 minutes early and choosing it. Outside on Baltimore Avenue, the November rain began to fall. Donnie did not find this significant. She made the coffee. She waited for Thursday to begin.
What the grieving leave behind was written for Ripper's nighttime tales. If this story stayed with you, it was meant to. The room on Newberry Street is closed. There are other rooms. There are always other rooms. Thank you for listening. We will see you in the dark.